Magic and Mystery by Allegory for Hatred. All rights go to Allegory for Hatred. I do not own this story. 21 A Great Show of Loyalty. Dear Mori, I'm about to do something stupid. Once again, Dazai was intimately grateful that his shitty doctor wasn't at Hogwarts with him. He was certain Mori would hit him over the head and tell him to keep his head down. Follow the Slytherin prefects to the library until the troll threat was taken care of. I mean, it's not that stupid, he silently drafted the letter in his head. But you'd probably still call me suicidal for it. Mori called him suicidal for most things, like mixing random medicines together and speaking out of turn. Dazai slipped away from the group, with all the care of someone who was used to getting in trouble whether they stayed in line or not. Then the letter would say, "You told me to make a friend, but Blaze isn't going to tell on me for running off. So this is kind of your fault, isn't it, Doctor?" He'd write that if he didn't run into the troll and die. Or a teacher. Dazai wasn't entirely convinced they wouldn't give him a grueling punishment for sneaking off that would leave him wanting to die. I'm just going to find Draco. He's a friend too. This really is your fault. Draco, wandering the third floor aimlessly, surely wouldn't know there was a troll in the dungeons, and Dazai, who hated being pushed together with all the other snakes, didn't mind the prospect of death by troll. Here's the thing, Dazai is used to being countless steps ahead of everything, but since coming to Hogwarts that just hasn't been the case. He's been behind, trying to read up and gather friends to even the playing field a bit. Like being thrown into the deep end. Dazai has been laying low, all things considered. But this troll was sort of a great opportunity to not be so out of his depth, and Draco was a great excuse if he got caught. As Dazai sprinted through the corridors he barely remembered, he considered how awesome a distraction this troll is for him to finally figure out what was on the third floor. He sent a silent thank you to the twins for letting him trail them around Hogwarts long. Enough to figure out some of the secret passages. Dazai was confident they didn't know he was using this information to sneak around when a troll was on the loose, but he wasn't entirely convinced they'd tell him off for it anyway. Something told him they might like to be involved in all the trouble he was about to get himself into. Unfortunately for the twins, getting in Draco's good graces was subplot A of this little endeavor, so they couldn't tag along even if Dazai was willing to spend the time trying to find them. So much for self-restraint. Dazai bounded up the stairs with just the eager he generally reserved for sneaking around. He was pretty sure this was the third floor now. Really, Dazai was the last person to know how to navigate Hogwarts, but this seemed right. He'd certainly never been around here before, and he was sure no one had classes in this hall. It was silent up here. Everyone else was hiding now. The hallway seemed to stretch on in that endless way most of Hogwarts did, and despite the fact that most of this floor was out of commission, there were still plenty of doors lining the walls. If they weren't teaching any classes up here, what were the professors using all these rooms for? Mindlessly, Dazai reached out to try one of the doors, only to find it locked. Luckily, Dazai was adept at lockpicking. After the 20th time you're locked in handcuffs and dropped him in the dog kennel, one tends to figure these things out. Even as the unpleasant memories washed over him, Dazai forced a smile onto his face. He was proud of this skill no matter where it came from. After a bit of maneuvering with one of the bobby pins Dazai always carried with him, the metal lock gave a satisfying click. He slipped the pin back into his coat, then took a careful step towards the now unlocked door. Just as Dazai was about to pull the handle, "What are you doing up here?" Dazai startled badly, flinching away from the door. Spine suddenly ramrod straight, Dazai turned to see who had caught him wandering around. Was that a professor? What sort of punishment would they dole out for sneaking around during these circumstances? The fear came without warning. Dazai couldn't help the way his smile went brittle. Dazai paused. His voice seemed to catch behind his teeth, swirling around like the taut, confused expression in his eyes. "Wait, troll." "I appreciate your attention to detail, boss." Draco glared. "What troll? There is no troll at Hogwarts. That'd be too dangerous. My father would never allow something like that to happen." The look he got in return was equal parts seething and panicked. The latter probably more on part of the loose beast Dazai had mentioned rather than his general disrespect for anything Malfoy. Still, Dazai only grinned lazily. Right. He trailed off coyly. I'll just cut to the chase. There's a troll loose in the castle. I came to warn you, since I'm such a loyal subordinate." Draco's face drained of what little color his already had. "You aren't serious." This brat is kind of gullible, Dazai thought, amused. You're welcome to wander down to the dungeons and see for yourself. Or you could sneak back into the library with me. As a fellow truant, I would suggest the latter. So much for wandering the third floor. He'd been hoping to find Draco after he'd had a chance to figure out what made this corridor so dangerous. Not that it mattered, really, since Dazai could sneak up here whenever he wanted now that he knew how to find the damn place. Between all the not doing homework and getting lost, he'd surely find the time somewhere. But the frightened look on Draco's face took precedence, mostly because Dazai was so used to seeing that mouth sneering or scowling. The difference would be more amusing if he wasn't actively in danger of being caught sneaking out at the moment. You pal around with those twins a lot, Draco huffed, all the uncertainty in his voice underlined with vague desperation. This is just a prank. He blinked. Draco was an idiot. It was an almost endearing quality up until the point that the boy would open his mouth. His first words were always some variation of idiot, and pure blood, and stop adding things to the potion, Dazai. Dazai rolled back on his heels. They should probably hurry up before someone noticed they weren't locked safely in the library with the other Slytherin students. He didn't have time for Draco to suddenly start doubting his honesty. Astute observation, boss. Unfortunately, I was saving my Unleash a Beast on the student body prank for second year. He pouted. I'm really risking a lot to come warn you, you know. The least you could do is praise me. For a moment, they locked eyes. Draco seemed to be fighting with himself over the prospect of a party and a troll, but it quickly became apparent that fear won out. Putting on a faux mocking look, Draco sniffed down at him. If you're lying and we get caught up here, I'm telling Professor Snape this was your fault. Draco hurried to bridge the last few steps between them. Thud. Hey, boss, you don't think that was the sound of your totally real party, do you? Draco shot him a glare that quickly flickered and died when another thud echoed down the long hall. Dazai suddenly became aware that the corridor was filled with a putrid stench. His nose wrinkled up unconsciously, but that did nothing to stop the reek of unwashed bodies from sticking to his tongue. Me neither. The thudding grew louder, closer, a steady thud-thud like a stumbling walk, like something massive walking right towards them, while Dazai's eyes quickly scanned the far end of the hall looking for whatever could be big enough to make that much noise just by walking. Draco, a subtle step closer to his side. Dazai stood up a bit straighter. It didn't take a genius to guess what kind of creature could make walking sound like an earthquake. A hand larger than Dazai's entire body wrapped itself around the corner of the wall. The force of this creature pulling itself forward cracked the stone wall. Rubble and stone clattered onto the floor. Draco tucked himself behind Dazai's body with a squeak. Dazai, too, felt himself tensing up in anticipation. The smell came first. From behind the wall, a blue humanoid monster stood at its full height, towering some 10 feet over Dazai's head. It had legs thicker than Dazai was tall, and a massive wooden club clutched between clawed, meaty fingers. Its small black eyes found them from across the hall. Dazai felt himself start to sweat unwittingly. The troll cast a shadow longer than the hallway and plunged the boys into darkness until the only light left was the whites of Draco's eyes. For a moment they did nothing but stare. I thought the troll was in the dungeons, Dazai murmured under his breath. Draco's fingers clutched into the overlong sleeve of Dazai's cloak, shaking with force and fear. Just as the blonde opened his mouth to suggest something, the troll sprung to life as well. It let out a raucous bellow that shook the walls and sent a cold shiver down Dazai's spine. There was enough force in that booming voice to rain dust and debris from the ceiling. With a roar, it charged towards them. Club bent back like the troll was preparing to beat them over the heads with it. Dazai's spine was locked in place. He couldn't move. The feeling of Draco at his back vanished with the sound of shoes clattering away. Draco ran, leaving Dazai behind in his haste. And Dazai couldn't move. The troll, all 12 feet of massive fungus-colored beast, reached a meaty paw out around Dazai, encircling him like a doll to be moved around. Dazai stared into its eyes. They were lifeless things. What a sight to be his last. He thought they looked like his own empty eyes. A gross reflection of his own death all this time. Even seconds from his death, Dazai couldn't stop that thought from forming. The sound of sprinting footsteps. Was Draco running back to help him? There was nothing for him to do. Dazai made peace with his death as much as he was able. The feeling of a claw around him was going to hurt. The second the troll's claws cracked around Dazai's back, the world exploded with blue light. No longer human burst to life with a loud scream in Dazai's ears and a burn in the base of his brain. It struggled against him, and the weight of a monster bending his bones until the corridor was nothing but the blue of his ability and Draco yelling about something. It was all blue and all pain, until Dazai's nose started crying blood, and the hand wrapped around his waist let his bones breathe again. The troll dropped to the ground, dead. Draco stopped shouting at exactly the same moment that Dazai felt his lungs reflate. He took in a deep, shaking breath. Each gasp for air stung, but Dazai swallowed it hungrily. The air tasted of blood. Dazai took another gasping breath and blinked down at the giant troll's fallen body. It didn't move even when he kicked it. No longer human had killed the troll. Huh, Dazai thought. Surprisingly, no thought followed it. He was feeling lightheaded, dizzy. Whatever had happened when the troll touched him, when it died, no longer human had massively overworked itself. The familiar tug of nausea and weariness hung over Dazai's bones, muting his thoughts and filling his head with cotton. It took a minute for him to remember his surroundings. Slowly, Dazai became aware of Draco manifesting at his side once again. The boy still looked shaken up. Draco took Dazai's sleeve and gave a pull on the fabric until they were facing one another. In a gasping voice, Draco whispered, "What the fuck, okay, what the fuck, Dazai?" He stared at Draco with what he hoped was a compelling expression, but was probably just as shell-shocked as the other boys. No longer human had just activated with enough force to give him a nosebleed, to shake his brains around. Dazai wasn't confident about his stoic expression at all. He was going to be sick. Right, okay. Draco nodded. There was a pinch to his eyebrows that Dazai couldn't interpret. Damn, his head hurt. Draco was his boss. The thought came numbly. He would take care of things. Dazai was scarcely aware that they were jogging more than they were walking. He was only really aware that they had later stopped when Draco started frantically wiping the blood from Dazai's nose with the sleeve he had commandeered. He'll sneak us into the library without the prefects noticing. Probably provide an alibi, too. Good lad. Draco nodded and disappeared around the corner. Dazai frowned at the easy compliance. That really wasn't like Draco. He's probably in shock. Dazai wondered, lifting his arm to swipe at his nose again. It came away slick with blood, and the words were just as bitter in his mind. Red smeared across his face when he tried to rub it off. It was barely a minute before Draco reappeared. He hustled Dazai in through a side door to the library with a bit more force than was strictly necessary. Dazai might have snapped at him, but his face was gummed up with blood and his thoughts were too clouded. They shuffled behind a row of bookcases, until they were tucked at the very back of the Slytherin crowd. Good, they were still here. If the snakes had cleared out from the library, that would mean the troll's body had already been found. We probably weren't seen. Get the blood off of your face, Draco hissed under his breath, only looking away from Dazai's frown when Blaze snuck up behind them. Can't, Dazai said. His voice slurred oddly, his pounding skull making it difficult to parse things out properly. Still bleeding. Dear Mori. The thought came unhindered and unwanted. So funny story. 22 Slytherin Loyalty Club. We trust him now? Pansy sneered, trying rather actively to wipe the shocked rage from her face. She flailed. Him? I, for one, completely trust him, Dazai hummed. He kicked his feet up onto the sofa, only to have them knocked off by a bored-looking Blaze. About half an hour after Draco and Dazai had snuck into the library with Blaze's help, Professor Snape had informed them that the lockdown was over, the troll taken care of. Curious wording for something Dazai knew the staff hadn't actually done. He had. Somehow. The four of them had immediately locked eyes, then not said a word as they trudged down into the dungeons. A silent pact disturbed only by Pansy's glares every few seconds. It wasn't until the Slytherin common room had cleared out that they commandeered the space for themselves and huddled up beside the roaring fireplace. You can't vouch for yourself. You can if you're not a coward, Blaze. Enough, Draco snapped. He ran a hand over his face, looking weary but sure. Dazai grinned lazily. This time when he tried to rest his legs on the sofa, Blaze only sighed. Victorious, he let his feet sit on the other boy's thighs. Sure thing, boss. Most of Blaze's acquiesce, Dazai thought, was concern. Dazai shuffled under the gaze. Now that his nose had stopped bleeding and his thoughts had cleared up, Dazai found all the worried glances were grating on his nerves. He was fine now. None of that doting was necessary in the slightest. He's a muggle-born, Draco. Pansy's voice was near a whisper, but it had all the venom of screaming. There's nothing he can do to prove himself loyal to a real wizard. Maybe that would shut them up for a while. Even the ambivalent Blaze tensed up underneath him. And Draco, who shouldn't be surprised at all considering he was literally there, was he surprised that Dazai had brought it up so casually? It wasn't like that mattered now. He did something to help me run away, he explained, shooting a pointed glare in Dazai's direction. So I trust him. End of discussion. Shit, Blaze breathed. Facing down a troll, that's certainly one way to prove you're loyal. From her seat beside the chess set, Dazai saw Pansy's eyes narrow. He filed that away for later, then turned to grin tiredly at his footrest. It was pretty cool of me, right? Up until you got a nosebleed, sure. Draco rolled his eyes. You can't just run from a troll. Pansy's frown only deepened. What did he do, Draco? Draco grit his teeth together. He made a beckoning motion with his hands, until Pansy crept in a bit closer. Blaze shrugged but didn't move, possibly due in part to the fact that Dazai was using him as a footrest. Draco held himself tense. You don't tell anyone what I'm about to say, all right? Consider it a Slytherin secret of the highest order. Blaze raised a brow. Any particular reason why? Blaze. The other boy blinked. Was that a hint of bewilderment on the usually apathetic Blaze's face Dazai saw there? Even Dazai, who already knew exactly what Draco was going to say, felt himself tense up with the serious frown on his boss's face. He always did like dramatics. What Dazai didn't like was these Slytherin punks knowing that he could nullify a troll to death before he even knew exactly why that had happened. He wasn't averse to the idea so much as uncertain of it. Dazai was confident he could trust Blaze, but he kind of hated Pansy and Draco, although that was less a matter of trust than of taste. As it was, his lack of knowledge on the subject was turning Dazai's stomach inside out. Or maybe that was the lingering anxiety of a near-death experience. Who could say, really? Levitation charm, yet somehow he magicked it dead. Pansy stared him down in clear disbelief. Right. That obviously didn't happen was mostly unspoken. Draco must have heard it anyway, with how he tensed up and cautiously glanced in Dazai's direction. Taking pity on Draco, Dazai blinked lazily to his footrest. Blaze, you seem very calm about all this. I mean, he shrugged. I was starting to think you didn't even have magic. Accidentally spelling a troll to death is kind of a relief, to be honest. You believe this nonsense? Pansy practically shrieked. She was quickly shushed by Draco, but she started speaking again almost immediately. You know I trust you, Draco, but he's bad news. You know he doesn't belong in Slytherin. How do you know it wasn't your magic to that? That killed the troll. Dazai groaned silently into his sleeve when a spike of pain lanced through his head. Goodness. Couldn't they fight over him tomorrow? The no longer human-induced headache had only ramped up throughout the evening, now an ever-present spike drilling slowly through his brain. He looked for something throwable to get everyone's attention, but gave up after a few seconds of looking. Instead, he interrupted Draco mid-sentence. You keep saying I'm not a real Slytherin, he commented tiredly. But if I wasn't sorted in Slytherin, I would never have gone up to save Draco. Pansy's eyes narrowed. Because you're not a real Slytherin. Maybe not by traditional means. Blaze shrugged, seeming to pick up on Dazai's train of thought easily enough. But maybe he was sorted for a different reason. Like being an awesome subordinate, or saving your life, or losing all of our house points. That was you? Dazai continued right over Pansy's exclamation. You keep fighting about it, but if it weren't for me, Draco would be dead right now. Dazai melted further into the sofa, until most of his weight was either pressed into the corner of a cushion or pushed onto Blaze's lap. Ah, does that make me more loyal than Pansy? Since she hasn't actually done anything to help. What? Snorting, Blaze quirked a brow. I wouldn't go quite that far, but he does have a point. Do you know how powerful someone has got to be to just accidentally kill a troll? He continued instead, For someone we consistently write off as not being a true Slytherin, he's done a lot to support us snakes. Ah. Dazai blinked a few times to clear his vision, expression a bit stunned, mostly by reflex. I'm in your care then. Please treat me kindly. Here, here, Blaze answered listlessly. Pansy glared, but after a moment her expression seemed to melt into a passive bitterness. Fine, huh. Professor Sprout's lecture had been worthless after all. It was good to know that the Port Mafia method of loyalty, do something vaguely threatening, won out over all that plant analogy nonsense in the end. At least he wasn't the plant in this situation. This is adorable. We've got our own little club, Dazai cheered. A little Slytherin club for trust and loyalty and whatever. I nominate Blaze as club president. No. Okay, but I don't like Pansy and Boss shouldn't be bothered with something so tedious, since that leaves only me. Draco tossed a chess piece at him, but Dazai only let it smack him in the stomach and fall to the floor. There is no loyalty club. Are you sure you don't have brain damage? Good morning, loyalty club. I want to die, he replied, smiling while he dropped the offered bagel onto Pansy's plate without taking a bite. So about normal, I guess. Good. I think... why do I regret this already? Mori, you might be getting a letter in the mail soon about the suspicious death of a troll. I wouldn't worry about it so much. But in case you did get a letter like that, I've attached a list of potential reasons you could reply with for why it definitely wasn't me who killed that troll. Since you told me to make friends, this whole situation is kind of your fault. On a related note, no longer human can kill magical creatures. I'm still looking into it. There's something strange about everything that happened last night, but asking you about it won't get me very far, right? If you ever deign to tell me the purpose of this mission, feel free. Otherwise, I have a class to get to. I've told the owl to hide something dead in your office. Good luck finding it. Dazai. 23 Dazai absolutely gets lost. All day Dazai had been on edge. He wasn't stressed or worried or anything like that, no. He was on edge because the teachers were on edge. It wasn't 5 minutes into his first lecture of the day when Dazai noticed Professor Flitwick's eyes scanning the students like he was hunting something down. It took a moment with how that headache was still pounding on in the back of his skull, but eventually Dazai realized they were worried. As far as the staff knew, someone unknown had killed the troll, and it wasn't one of them. There was little more dangerous than someone powerful sneaking under your nose undetected. Judging by the way Professor McGonagall stalked the halls and how Professor Snape glared with more force than usual. They still didn't know, but they wanted to. It was odd. Even Professor Quirrell was extra vigilant. Quirrell, who was always stuttering and floundering, looked him dead in the eyes as he entered the dark arts class, searching through each student, searching for him. Dazai sighed, his headache still screaming, the pressure of his professors, the looming knowledge of Draco's lesson today. He'd much rather just die. But at the same time, he was interested to learn about the troll and about his ability. Pinching the bridge of his nose, Dazai let his thoughts mute and mumble until there was nothing more than static bouncing around behind his eyes. One thing at a time. The Loyalty Club's latest endeavors to indoctrinate him into Slytherin ideals were going to include magic training, which was going to be disastrous, but maybe a little funny. Dazai wasn't sure what Draco thought they were going to get out of this whole thing, but if he knew one thing, it was that Draco liked to subordinate others. Couldn't get much more under someone's thumb than being their student. Or pet. Really depended on who you asked. But really, this was just another test of loyalty in a long line of them. Saving Draco's life was a good step, but it would never be enough. He'd always just be the Muggleborn to them, which was fine. Dazai didn't care. He did find it amusing, though, that his magic show last night shocked a Slytherin gang enough for them to realize, hey, maybe let's not just let him run around doing whatever. If this had been the Mafia, he'd have ground someone like that beneath his heel by now. Sneaking out, even if he had killed the troll and saved Draco, would put a stain on the Slytherin name. You don't damage the Port Mafia's good name and walk away with all your limbs intact. Dazai, are you sleeping with your eyes open again? He blinked. Hermione frowned down at him, somehow managing to look annoyed and concerned at the same time. Class is over. She glanced over to his notes. You know, you're going to fail if you don't start writing things down, and you'll never be able to start a successful career if you don't pass your classes now. With a hum, Dazai started to gather his things up. His brain thrummed painfully at the movement, but he tried not to let that show in the pinch of his brows. I've already got a job lined up. What, already? You're 11. Oh dear, am I falling behind? It's a family business. With all of his supplies in his bag, Dazai got to his feet. As they started to leave the classroom side by side, she asked, "Oh, what do your parents do?" His nose scrunched up. What was the best way to explain the mafia without describing all of the backhanded deals and assassination they did? After a pause, he finally settled on, "Mori is a doctor, private practice." As an afterthought, he added, "I'll take over the business when he finally croaks." Well, something like that. Hermione gasped. "Dazai, you really shouldn't say things like that. I'm sure your dad cares a lot for you." Dazai shrugged. "What do your folks do for a living, then?" "Not mafia work, obviously." Hermione didn't really have that dangerous air about her like he and Quirrell did, though he still hadn't given up on the possibility of a wizarding mafia. "Oh, both of my parents are dentists, which is why grades are so important. When I do figure out what I want to do when I'm older, there won't be a single opportunity I can't reach." She spared him a curious glance. "Is that not the case with being a doctor? I'd think you would care a lot about grades if you were planning to do something like that, especially with how you'll have to go to medical school." "Ah, Hermione's so mean. Aren't you ever tired of making fun of my poor grades?" While Hermione immediately started trying to backtrack, Dazai felt a shiver roll up his spine. There was a chill to the air now that Halloween had passed, and it made the dungeons even more unbearable than before. But with the troll fiasco forced him down there more than he'd like. Now wasn't the time to wander and risk looking abnormal. Not until he figured out exactly what no longer human nullifying a troll meant. And certainly not until he knew why the troll was there in the first place. Speaking of. "Hey!" Hermione startled out of her ramblings, lips downturned in obvious displeasure at being interrupted. "How do you think the troll got in Hogwarts last night? It must have wandered in from the cold, right?" She hummed, thoughtful. "Or maybe it was drawn in by all the magic we were using to decorate." Dazai blinked. That was an interesting hypothesis. "Ah, why would that be by chance? Leading him up the stairs?" Hermione beamed. She was always eager to talk about something she had learned, Dazai knew. It would have been an endearing quality, but Dazai couldn't get over the fact that she read for pleasure and not for information, so she could manipulate people later. Some people were just of different strokes, he reasoned. Well, trolls are magical creatures, aren't they? I read about it just this morning in light of what happened. Most magical creatures need to feed off of the latent magic in the air or they'll die. I imagine this particular troll smelled a feast and thought to invite himself. That was exactly what he was looking for. If a troll needed magic to survive, then touching Dazai would have nullified what was essentially its lifeblood. What other creatures worked on that principle? If he was a betting man, he'd say goblins and ghosts probably worked on the same system. Dazai could easily recall his earlier experiences with both of those creatures. They had both gone out of their way to avoid touching him, hadn't they? Dazai felt a grin slip onto his face as his satisfaction began to match Hermione's obvious eagerness. I don't know why we don't talk more. You're the most helpful person here. Oh, well. She flushed. Thank you. Always, my lady. Dazai couldn't help but snort when Hermione's face bloomed an even deeper shade of crimson. Guess his library readings would be moving off of history and onto magical creatures. Dazai was going to wear a hole in his seat at the library if he kept finding interesting things to read like this. Still, it was almost nice to have something like that to keep him busy. He always preferred feeling overwhelmed to feeling listless. There was plenty of lying around and doing nothing back home. Dazai scratched at his wrist, frowning at the uncomfortable thought. Abruptly, Dazai stopped dead in his tracks. Hermione startled and turned back to face him after a second when she realized he was no longer following. Her lips quirked into a curious frown. What's wrong? Did you forget something in the classroom? Shaking his head, Dazai quickly assured her, No, that's not it. Well then, I'm lost. Hermione's face went blank for a second before being quickly replaced by a look of mortal confusion. You're lost? You're following me, how are you lost? I mean, he said, glancing around the hallway. It was a long corridor lined with doors, moving paintings, and sets of armor. His explorations with the twins had certainly helped him to understand the layout of Hogwarts, but only with places he actually wanted to go to, like class and the third-floor corridor, apparently. If Dazai had seen this particular hall before, he'd wiped it from memory until it was just a blur amongst the other identical winding hallways. Where are we going? What's even over here? She sighed fondly. Only you could get lost when following a guide, Dazai, and there are quite a few things this way. The Gryffindor common rooms, for one. Oh, we won't be going there. I don't think I'll be able to let you in given your being a Slytherin and all. There's another door to the library too. That's where I was headed, actually. Almost reluctantly, she added, You haven't got to come if you'd rather not, although I was hoping to discuss the various applications of aconite in potion brewing. Isn't that our essay homework for potions? Are you trying to cheat off of me? And here I thought Hermione was the moral one. He tutted. Hermione squeaked. I always follow the rules. I was hoping you would take the initiative and actually do your homework. I've done my homework. Once. Not that it had been worth it. Professor Sprout's lesson in loyalty had been functionally useless. If he'd known all he needed to do was kill a troll to get in Draco's good books, he'd have just done that instead. All that plant nonsense was just a huge waste of his time. Just once isn't enough to pass. Aren't you worried about final exams? Dazai shrugged, swaying on his feet a little. He'd heard from Fred and George that most of the final exams were practical, showing off the magic Dazai was genuinely incapable of doing. Funnily enough, the mafioso was fairly certain he'd be flunking out at the end of the year. He'd probably have some suspicious professors on him asking how he'd even been enrolled too. Something told Dazai Hermione wouldn't buy that. Everything passes. He said instead, somewhat serious, mostly by mistake, Anyway, I can't come to the library with you. Draco and company are starting a club. I should probably show up, especially considering the club was literally made around him being entirely useless with magic. If anything, he was at least curious to see whatever lesson they had concocted. It couldn't be any worse than the lessons he had back home. The though lead Dazai's mind astray, such that when he blinked back to attention, he wasn't sure why Hermione's brows were pinched together in concern. Sorry, did you say something? She sighed. I said, are you safe, going off with them? I know you mentioned they were bullying you. I'm certain Professor McGonagall would help if you told her. Dazai contemplated saying, it's not that bad, or I can manage, or even some variation of, if they were a real problem, I'd have killed them by now. But none of those seemed appropriate for a supposedly victimized schoolboy to say. Instead, he smiled sheepishly and wore that warm and soft persona to the ground. Is Hermione so concerned about me? Have you fallen in love with me? I'm afraid I only accept potential suicidals for that sort of relationship. Well, almost warm and soft. Dazai would blame it on the headache. Dazai! She shrieked, flushing redder than a ripely picked apple. I'm concerned as a friend, not AA. Plastering a wide smile onto his face, Dazai let himself chuckle. You're too easy to tease. I read a really nice book the other day called How Not to Fall for Stupid Pranks. You should study that instead of potions. She looked skeptical, but the blush on her face made it hard to discern. She was right to be skeptical, of course, considering Dazai wasn't even sure such a book existed. In the end, Hermione didn't rise to the bait except to give him a suitably scolding look. She sighed. I really am concerned, you know. I know. Dazai shrugged, eyes squinting through a piercing headache. Walk me to the library? I really haven't got a clue where we are. Hermione sighed indulgently. Do you want to write this down? I have arrived. Draco shot to his feet, sending a few bright red leaves into the air with a furious crinkle. Beside him, Pansy was much more graceful in standing up, which is to say about as graceful as a rabid dog. Blaise didn't even move. Where have you been? Draco shouted, flailing his arms around. Our club was supposed to meet 30 minutes ago. Oh, Merlin. Now you've got me saying it. Oh, he answered blankly. I got lost. The blonde's mouth dropped open like he might have been struggling to find adequately reprimanding words. In the end, the shit-eating grin Dazai wore must have turned him off, because Draco whirled on someone else instead. Or Blaise. Weren't you going to make sure he didn't get lost again? I'm not his babysitter. Do it yourself. This was your idea. When Blaise only shrugged and turned the page in his Transfiguration textbook with an aura that exuded apathy, Dazai piped up, I saved your life. Cut me some slack. I know that. And now we're going to train you to do that again. But on command this time. You're welcome to try, but I have a track record of ignoring people who tell me what to do. I mean, Professor Snape has been bugging me to go to the nurse for ages now, and I'm still not even sure where that place is. He flicked Dazai on the arm. Put some effort into being a good subservient snake, will you? You've proven you're trustworthy, but you still aren't very useful. Your bullying is as on point as ever, boss. Good, Draco preened. Today you'll be practicing the levitation spell. Even a child could do that one. 24 blowback. Dazai looked up from his wand just in time to see Draco give up completely. It was a good look for him, and Dazai much preferred it to the look of general disdain the boy normally wore. Evidently, 1 week of Dazai failing magic repeatedly was too much of a hassle. At some point along the way, training time had become Blaze's homework time and Draco's yell at Dazai time. Every hour of the day was always hate Dazai time for Pansy, so nothing new there. A strong gust of wind blew through their training clearing. Blaze's essay flapped loudly against it. The tiny rock weighing it down rolled. Ah. Did Blaze realize his essay was about to blow away? If it flew into the forbidden forest, he wasn't going to be able to get that back. Now that's a great place to start next lesson. Mortal peril. Pansy cheered from over Draco's shoulder. I can fire different spells at him and see what happens. No, Draco and Blaze said together. With a sigh, Blaze finally set his book down. Beside him, his essay continued to kick against the wind. I don't know why you think he's going to learn anything if a quarter of the year hasn't taught him any magic yet. Are we absolutely sure it wasn't just a fluke he killed the troll? I know the professors have all but given up on him, but I'm sure with my expert tutelage Dazai will get it right soon. Eventually. After all, I've had elite tutors since long before coming to Hogwarts. I'm sure I'll be able to teach him something. He frowned, looking momentarily quite thoughtful. And fluke or not, even accidental magic can't kill a mountain troll unless the wizard was crazy powerful. I'd like to return to my mortal peril plan, actually. Dazai beamed, pointing his useless wand in Pansy's direction, clearly knowing it wouldn't do anything. Pansy didn't even flinch as the spell-casting weapon was shoved in her face. I second that plan, he said. Like most things in Dazai's miserable existence, the best and worst case outcome for Pansy's proposal were the same thing. He died. Blaze shot down the idea with little more than an eyebrow raise. Feeling petty, Dazai silently willed the boy's Dada essay to take flight. And magical creatures, he was stuck waving a stick around in a field. Not to mention that his naso and headache still hadn't completely faded. Running around outside all day was only making him feel worse. But somehow Dazai didn't absolutely hate it. It was a weird feeling, one he was completely unfamiliar with. He almost enjoyed hanging out with these losers? Ugh. His head pounded sharper in repulsion. This whole feeling thing was disgusting. So Dazai was mostly choosing to focus on the negatives here, no free time, waving a stick around, etc. Speaking of, Dazai gave his wand another cursory flick, muttering, Wingardium Leviosa mechanically. The spell was practically burnt into his tongue with how many times he had uttered it over the last few days. When nothing happened, he turned back to see Draco and Pansy bickering. Dazai pinched the bridge of his nose. We owe it to him to at least make him functional. Draco hissed, He saved my life. Pansy quickly countered, He saved the life of his better entirely by accident. Well, she's not wrong, Dazai said, clapping his hands together. Another wave of the wand here, another chanted spell there. Dazai felt a bit like he was conducting an orchestra. Blaze's essay flapped and fluttered in the wind like raucous applause. Dazai had read that book front to back already, if only just to understand his potential enemies better. Nothing in there could possibly help him, but it was interesting to see how wizards had operationalized magic. As far as Dazai could tell, wizards were manipulating something latent in the air that Dazai, just by existing, erased. It was fruitless research, really, but he felt at ease knowing he could render these wizards useless with a single touch. Wingardium? What was it again? Leviosa, Blaze replied, languidly turning a page. You know what it is, maybe. Dazai rubbed at his eyes after attempting to cast another time. He hadn't quite gained his energy back since killing the mountain troll on Halloween. Whatever he'd done to that thing must have overworked no longer human and left him feeling the effects all week. His headache had only gotten worse, too. And with Mori's reply about Halloween coming in tomorrow, Dazai had been unwittingly quite unwell. He couldn't help but fear the worst. Even with Mori miles and miles away, Dazai shivered in sick anticipation. He only waved his blackthorn wand in answer. Blaze's paper flapped in the wind, Pansy rolled her eyes, and Dazai didn't do magic. Same old, same old. What was different was the faint buzzing in the back of Dazai's head. It was the familiar sting of no longer human upset by the magic surrounding the castle, and further compounded by how overworked it was. But there was something else as well. Something fuzzy tinting the edges of his vision black. Something fuzzy like this. Dazai flicked his wand and muttered the spell just right, then promptly passed out. His vision swam, turning the flat line of trees to his left into a crashing wave of foliage. There was an obnoxious high-pitched tone coming from the base of Dazai's skull, loud enough that it was all he could hear, even when Draco's mouth still had the appearance of opening in speech. What were he and Pansy talking about again? Dazai couldn't tell for how dizzy everything had suddenly become. Even his thoughts were blanking out. Then, without warning, he smacked into the dirt like a sack of flour-sent atomble. The last thing he saw before the whole world turned black was Blaze's essay flying south into the forbidden forest. Dazai tried not to feel too pleased with that, but with how quickly he blacked out, it's a wonder that he felt anything at all. There was blood on his small hands that didn't feel out of place, though he couldn't tell what was bleeding with how shadowed the world was. It was dark. The room was oppressively dark. Something quiet and murmuring in his brain that he should be thankful it was far too dark to see. He reached out with quaking baby-fat fingers to find the source of blood, but instead a larger hand wrapped around his own. A hand calloused and unkind. It must have been Father's. Dazai's hand was a landscape of black and blue, while Father's was the blade ready to turn him into a jigsaw puzzle. He'd never done a puzzle with a picture before. But where was the blood coming from? The tang of color in the air, the stain of red in his skull, the picture frame closing him in. Oh, he's dreaming. When did he fall asleep? Dazai felt a sort of guilty relief when the hand holding his turned to smoke. The midnight room vanished into something more vague and pointless, less of a dream and more of a thought now. His heart pounded noisily around his skull, an echoing thing like drums. Was he afraid? He didn't feel very afraid, but his chest was tight and aching with unshed tears. His dreams were always too vague, but the dread was very, very real. Dazai had blacked out many times throughout the duration of his first 11 years of life, usually from blood loss. Because of this, he was intimately familiar with the sensations of waking being the following: the beeping of a heart monitor, the sting of fresh wounds, the patronizing chattering of one Dr. Mori Ugai. Not one of these things was present now, however, such that Dazai wasn't entirely sure he'd actually woken up. If sleep begged to take over, Dazai wouldn't bother to fight it. He always did prefer dreamless slumber to waking, but something was different this time. Was it the press of a thin cotton blanket tucked over his arms like a tight coffin? Or maybe it was something like, that. A voice he didn't recognize in the slightest. The foreign voice was warm in tone and gentle like water falling over stones. Around the corners of every word, there was a touch of agedness to the sound. Dazai felt himself melt into the voice almost accidentally. The hum was quickly followed by the sound of clicking heels and more thoughtful breaths. I see. You four simply must be more careful when practicing magic. Make sure everyone is feeling well before doing anything outside of teacher supervision. Yes, ma'am. Oh, he recognized those voices, though. Draco, Blaze, even the reluctant grunt of Pansy. Everyone in the Slytherin faction of Dazai's gang was here. Now, the mysterious voice continued, suddenly edged with quiet stubborn. All of you, get out. Dazai, eyes resolutely shut, took great pleasure in imagining the affronted look that must have accompanied the rich boy gasp Draco emitted. He almost opened his eyes just to see, but felt the allure of pretending to be asleep more profitable. After all, Dazai still wasn't quite sure where he was, or really why, for that matter. He won't get any better with you lot standing around. Out, out! He needs his rest now. Behind the shuffle of the Loyalty Club shuffling resignedly out of the room, Dazai put himself to dissecting everything that had just happened. The sound of a door clicking shut told Dazai it was just him and the stranger left, now. Dazai read the black of his eyelids for answers. He had passed out. Why was an entirely separate mystery. No longer human had been acting funny since Halloween, but that shouldn't have been enough to knock him out a week after the incident. Something else must have been at play. But what? Dazai squeezed his eyes shut, trying for force a realization. When none came, he shifted his attention onto a currently more pressing matter. Dazai rolled the facts through his mind. He had passed out. Draco and company had brought him here. They felt comfortable enough to leave their sick friend here, unsupervised. And that meant, was he finally at the infirmary like Snape had instructed? Dazai's rust-colored eyes popped open with all the intention of fox locking onto its prey. The owner of that sun-baked voice was an older-looking woman with a wrinkled, thoughtful smile pursing her lips together. She had curly gray locks of hair peeking out from behind the white cloth over her head, and thin, bluer-than-blue eyes. Looking around the room at all the corked potions and equipment, this must be the Madame Pomfrey Lady Professor Snape had been talking about. Damn, Dazai had been hoping to keep that up a bit longer. At least until Pansy snapped and finally tried to strangle him to death. And he'd been so close, too. Involuntarily, Dazai let out a little groan at the blinding light of wakefulness. Just like Dr. Mori's infirmary, places like these were always obnoxiously bright. He was starting to think it was a requirement that places of medicine be unbearable to exist in. Or maybe it was just that the notion anyone would want to be healed, to live longer, always made him sick too. His stomach. Dazai was usually much better at hiding weak noises like that, though. Maybe he really was sick. However, she didn't say anything to that effect, only replying softly, "I'm sure." Pomfrey watched him for a moment longer, then silently grabbed the curtain and pulled it tighter around Dazai's cot. He drew in a claustrophobic breath. The curtains now hiding them away from the rest of the room buzzed with the faint tickle of magic. Some kind of privacy charm? He'd have to look more into when he wasn't being backed into a corner. When she took a step closer, the mafioso's spine tensed automatically. "It's just us here, but things like this are more delicate than the scrapes and bruises you kids tend to come to me for." Her smile was fond for a second, before splitting into unrestrained concern. Dazai's eyes narrowed into thinner slits. The matron's whole figure seemed to bleed compassion. It was warm and slimy and was giving Dazai a stomachache. Hermione should take notes. Her eyes trailed over Dazai's curled-up figure, almost assessing before opening her mouth to speak. Which was also the exact moment Dazai realized. "Do you feel comfortable talking to me about this?" She'd unwrapped his bandages. 25, only with your eyes closed. The scars stared back up at him with an unfortunate intensity, rotting a pit of buzzing panic in his skull. Dazai almost couldn't breathe for the still shock that ran through him. Countless thin white and pink lines race across his wrists and snake up towards his elbows. He didn't want to see the patchwork spider's web of cuts marring his flesh, marking him as something incomplete. They looked objectively quite damning, and it didn't take a trained professional like Madame Pomfrey to see that many of them would have been deep enough to kill, if only. What she must not have noticed, however, was that not all of the scars were by Dazai's hand. He recognized the precise marks in his elbow as Mori's love, the brutal, thoughtless dents as father's gifts, and only then the layered slashes as his own desperation. He could try and give each scar a name, but he'd get lost in the grave of memories too easily. Even when he's cutting, Dazai didn't look. It was like looking at someone else's arm. A human's arm. A demon's. Looking at it now, even with the caution that came with having an audience, Dazai's brain just stops, short circuits. He didn't want to see it. He never wanted to see it, this thing he had become. And he never wanted anyone else to see it either. The headache, pounding out a steady beat, went silent behind the crash of an untamed heartbeat. The marks on his arms were improper and unsightly, and they stung with the weight all the horrible things Dazai didn't like thinking about. What sort of feeling was that? "I truly want every student here to feel at home." Madame Pomfrey continued sedately, seeming not to notice the strange panic coursing through the boy before her. She pointedly looked away from Dazai's arms, a skewed sort of privacy. "I don't mean to overstep any boundaries, dear, so I won't pressure you to talk. Just know that if you ever need anything, you are welcome to come straight to me." She wanted a response, but Dazai couldn't quite speak. It burned a childish shame into him, but his focus was so locked onto the arms he hadn't seen in ages that words seemed like a stretch out of possible. Couldn't respond, because the weight of that scar on his arm there, and this one on his wrist, bore here. It all bore the heavy hand of father yelling, and he could hear it echoing now. The matron sighed, softer and louder than his memory all at once. I have to tell your head of house about this, I am sorry about that. But I need to know that you'll be safe. Her smile was bitter when she set a roll of fresh cotton bandages on the side table. There are a few things we need to talk about before I can send you on your way, but I imagine you'll want to be covered up firstly. Would you prefer to do it yourself? Yes, ma'am. Madame Pomfrey only smiled oddly, then excused herself outside the confines of the charmed curtains. Dazai wondered if she had noticed the way his voice shook with effort. He hoped not. But now that he was alone, relatively, Dazai let his eyes fall closed as he took to applying the fresh bandages. They stayed closed until the buzz of memories and pain and inhumanity died away, replaced only by a sense of distance. Apathy, maybe. Dazai had always been an expert at smothering his emotions. The anxiety and shame now were no different. He covered all his panic beneath cotton gauze. Dazai had applied his bandages so many times over the years that even now he could do it perfectly without ever seeing. Even now, with his fingertips numb. Even now. Dazai took a deep breath and opened his eyes. He was pleased to see only his second skin of cotton and cloth when he worked up the energy to finally look. It was a scratchier bandage than he was used to. A special kind of torture just for Dazai was having a body at all. But no matter, Dazai's practice at self-restraint made wrangling his emotions relatively easy work. A deep breath and the drag of his nails over two thin wrists drowned out any residual panic. Never say he wasn't good at compartmentalizing. Never say he wasn't good at not feeling anything at all. Dazai blinked, staring down at the rest of his body where it was hidden under a cloth. Madame Pomfrey hadn't taken off any of his other bandages, only the ones on his arms. He was relieved, momentarily, that she hadn't seen everything. He was more relieved that he didn't have to see everything, though. If only just to prove his inhumanity to himself, Dazai drew a sly smile onto his face and readied a barb on his tongue. It all felt a bit hollow now. He should just get up and leave. If he was quick enough, Pomfrey might not even notice. Her concern was noxious. But, no, long-term that wasn't a viable solution. While he was at school here, there was a certain level of control he was sacrificing. If the matron was serious about worrying over Dazai's scars, she would eventually, regardless of any scheme Dazai could whip up. Professor Snape, too, if his insistence at going to the infirmary was any indication. Not that he had any semblance of control back home with Mori and father. A flash of his Gryffindors and the Loyalty Club flashed through Dazai's head, seemingly without cause. He shook the thought away, feeling bitter. Dazai sighed, pushing the aimless sickness at having seen such a damaged arm. He reached out to brush the back of his fingers against the curtain, feeling immediately whatever charm had been in place there flicker and die. No longer human buzzed in response but didn't make his headache any worse. Dazai wasn't sure his head could hurt any more than it already did, to be fair. "I'm done," he called, feeling a vague sense of satisfaction when his voice didn't quiver at all. It was a stone, his voice, cold and empty and nothing more. Moments before Pomfrey's head ducked in through the curtains, Dazai stuffed the remaining bandages under the too long sleeve of his cloak. If the healer noticed their going missing, her gentle smile would have been the only tell. Dazai grinned right back, because his smile was ugly and fake, too. "I'll just get right to the point," Pomfrey began. "You are extremely malnourished. Expending extra magic by practicing spells with your friends was using up what little energy you already had, forcing your body to fall unconscious." Right, Dazai thought, tearing his focus from the feeling of being so exposed. "I have to deal with you first. If Pomfrey digs too deep into this, she'll eventually find out about the Port Mafia. Couldn't have that." Dazai frowned, thoughtful. Using magic. Well, nullifying the troll to death had taken a lot out of him. Damn. He hadn't thought it had been that bad, though. He reached his hands together thoughtlessly to scratch at the skin there, but pulled them back the second he felt the fresh bandage pull over his arms. "Unfortunately, there isn't a spell I have that can fix this. Are you eating all 3 meals every day?" "Well, I had candy last week. Does that count?" "When I remember to." The pitying expression she wore seemed to expect that response. "It might be difficult, but you do need to eat more. Otherwise, I'm afraid you'll only grow weaker." Something changed in her expression that Dazai couldn't track. "And you're too thin already, dear. That young man carried you all the way here like you were nothing more than a stuffed doll." Dazai winced. 3 meals a day, remember? If it's too hard, you can start with something small just so long as you're eating something, hun. And If you ever have the urge to hurt yourself, just know you can come straight to me or Professor Snape, all right? Dazai looked away, and his scars stung. When he replied, his voice was hollow around the edges. Yes, ma'am. Good. Pomfrey frowned. It looked like there was more she wanted to say. More she wanted to fuss over. Maybe it was the slipping mask of horror and shame dawning on Dazai's face, but instead of pushing, she only said, I suppose you can be on your way then. Curfew is soon, so be sure to hurry straight back to your dormitory. Oh, was it that late already? Thank you, good night. Madame Pomfrey gave him a somber look and stepped back so Dazai could get to his feet. Once he was standing, she added, I want to see you back here in 2 weeks, all right? That's the 21st, dear. Just to make sure we're doing all right. Dazai smiled pleasantly. Is that all? She hummed in a way that seemed far more like a sigh than anything more casual. Go on back, then. I'm afraid the kitchens are closed to students at this hour, but I've left a few snacks for you by the door. Take them with you on the way out. Once he was sure he was permitted to leave, Dazai hurried out of the infirmary with an embarrassing amount of eagerness. He couldn't stand the idea of being interrogated by a doctor any longer, even if Pomfrey was significantly less repulsive than Dazai's own Dr. Mori was. On his way out, he grabbed the small bag of food that had laid out for him, if only just to appease the matron. The bag crinkled beneath his numb fingers. Eyes open but not really seeing, Dazai followed his own feet blindly down the hall. Malnourished, the words tasted funny on his tongue. It wasn't that unusual to go so long without eating. Dazai frequently went long periods without eating. The only logical conclusion was that killing that mountain troll had taken more out of him than he had originally thought, and there were benefits to being so thin and small, Dazai thought defensively, like looking unassuming or being fast enough on his feet to dodge hits if his legs shook when he ran. That was because he wasn't good enough, not because he was starving. But thinking about how meager his body was just brought Dazai back to the topic of his mangled, scarred body, opening a gateway for more unwanted thoughts. He hadn't felt so out of control since before coming to Hogwarts. Waking up completely at someone else's mercy, this inhuman body on display. Maybe it was the familiarity that stung the most. Maybe it was the way that Dazai was at fault. How he should have just been better. Good enough to not pass out like a child. Or to go to Madame Pomfrey when he was well enough to manipulate the conversation. Dazai blinked, trying to chase the ugly feeling away, but instead only coming to realize he had absolutely no idea where he was. He really needed that map now. Also, probably not his greatest idea to let his mind wander while simultaneously navigating the ever-confusing halls of Hogwarts. Whatever. Today was already such a mess. Why not also get lost after curfew? Just one more thing to the pile of already tedious things he'd done today. Dazai tried to conjure a mental map in his head, but was left with only a vague impression of where some particularly interesting secret passages were, courtesy of the Weasley twins, none of which would help him now, of course, considering he had no point of reference for his exact location. He looked around for something identifiable. When nothing stuck out to him after a few minutes of searching, he pouted. Though they had nothing at all to say, the living paintings stared down at him through watercolor eyes. What's got you looking so glum, young snake? Dazai flinched. It wasn't until his eyes locked onto the transparent, bloody figure that he could relax. Oh, Mr. Ghost Guy. It's still barren. The Slytherin house ghost corrected, floating closer with a cautious eye, and it's awfully late to be wandering the halls. Where have you been then? The mafioso gave a cursory glance around the hallway. Just at the infirmary. Only I don't really see the appeal in staying healthy, so I think I'll just commit suicide like you did. The stairway is probably tall enough that if I jumped off while it was moving, my neck would snap. Voice too flat. Dazai didn't really sound like he was joking this time. He bit down on his tongue as if that might wake it up. Right. I'd say you should hurry back to the dungeons before Filch finds you out this late. But perhaps it's best if I escort you. Aw, Mr. Ghost is no fun. That was better. If the Baron glared at him in response, that was really neither here nor there. Regardless, the ghost floated away without another word, except to grumble under his haunted breath. Dazai trailed 2 steps behind him with all the blind trust of someone with no care for their own life. There was probably some reason to how the bloody Baron navigated the halls of Hogwarts, but Dazai couldn't make sense of it. As they walked, the itch and burn of cheap cotton made Dazai's arms sting. It drew him back to the look in Madame Pomfrey's eyes, the concern thick in her voice. She knew about that now, had seen just how inhuman Dazai was. What was she going to do to him for it? Dazai couldn't shake the sick feeling. After a moment of following unobtrusively, Dazai's internal panic completely silent, he forced himself to think about something else. Something. The Baron shot him a sideways glance. "Ah, Mr. Ghost Guy, what happens if I touch you?" A frown creased the Baron's face as he turned to stare down at his temporary ward. "That other ghost ran away when I tried to touch him," Dazai clarified. "Which other ghost?" "Some jester." If he had to guess, which Dazai was usually fond of doing, considering he was generally always right, the bandaged boy would say that the Baron would die just like the troll had. But what was more interesting was if the Baron knew that. When they had first met, the ghost had mentioned an unusual aura around Dazai, but never specified exactly what that meant. But after what had happened on Halloween night, there was a definite theory Dazai was curious to confirm about it. "Ah," the Baron hissed. "Peeves, obnoxious little poltergeist. Suppose he ran off to cause mischief and to make a general mess of things. He left you alone? When I reached out for him," Dazai reiterated helpfully. He retrieved the stolen bandages from his sleeve to drop them into the snack bag, drawing his lips together at the cheap texture. He screamed. Baron floated a few inches further away from Dazai at his announcement, but didn't seem surprised. "I would imagine so," he said after a moment. "I suspect most of the ghosts here have been steering clear of you. I ought to be doing the same, so be grateful I'm not leaving you here alone like a wiser spirit might." Dazai hummed, keeping his distance. "Even for an older ghost such as myself, I've truly never met someone with the aura you have." Auras, he'd casually looked for information on them during his studies. Dazai hadn't found much regarding them, at least insofar as it should apply to him and his situation, and certainly not in the capacity that made ghosts and goblins afraid of him. Although Dazai suspected the Baron wasn't sensing an aura in the traditional sense, rather he was likely sensing whatever impact no longer human was having on their surroundings. If the sting of his ability constantly nullifying the latent magic in the air was any indication, these magical creatures would likely be seeing. "It's almost like all the magic in the air is being drawn to you. Eaten up, I'd say." "Something like that. When no longer human nullifies the magic in the air, more magic floods into the space around him to fill the gap." Dazai's current theory was that his ability was sort of like a black hole for magic. Creatures like ghosts, who lived off of latent magic, would risk being nullified as well. It was a good theory, but still only a theory, and Dazai was hesitant to test it out. The mountain troll had been a great test run, and Hermione's research had helped a lot, but he couldn't be certain until he found a book on the relationship between magic and abilities. If such a book existed, which Dazai was starting to think wasn't the case, Dazai turned his eyes away from the Baron, brain catching on the phrase "eaten up." If only he could sustain himself on magic alone, then Pomfrey wouldn't have ever had to take off his bandages. But no longer human didn't do anything except give him a headache these days. He sighed, an invisible weight settling on his shoulders. "Here you are, young snake." Blinking, Dazai's attention snapped back to the ghost before trailing around the hallway. Now that he was looking, the school was no longer an unfamiliar maze. The Baron had walked him all the way back to the dungeons. Dazai hadn't even noticed. "Go on to your dorm, then. Perhaps we'll meet again sometime if you can ever explain that aura of yours to me." The bloody Baron's ghostly eyes tracked Dazai's twitching fingers with a weary gaze. Or perhaps not. A thought occurred to Dazai. His frown deepened and he asked, "Only you ghosts know about this aura? Were you wanting to keep it a secret?" "How very Slytherin of you." The Baron chuckled. "As far as I know, that's correct. Well, I haven't spoken to any of your professors about it, though I can't speak for anyone else. But that's enough talk for tonight. Go off to bed before Filch catches you out after curfew." The spirit didn't wait another moment before vanishing through a nearby wall. The second he was alone, the emotion dropped from Dazai's face, and his arms fell limp at his sides. He stared down the blank space on the wall where the Baron had faded through for only a brief pause, before turning back to the Slytherin entrance. Dazai murmured the password only just loud enough for the stone wall to hear, but the hall still echoed with his voice. That child's whisper that echoed around the empty corridor didn't sound like him, Dazai thought. He slipped in silently through the passage once it had opened. The common room was lit only by a flickering fire when Dazai crossed the space, but it was still cold enough to raise the hair on his neck. Pomfrey's bag crinkled when Dazai set it down on the chess table. The Black King seemed to be watching him. The fireplace crackled loudly, and Dazai turned to face it. "Welcome back, friend." 26 Blaze. "Blaze," Dazai said, blinking. He tried not to sigh too loudly, but the other snake had always been adept at reading cues like that regardless, so there wasn't really a point. "Can we do this tomorrow?" Blaze looked over Dazai's tense shoulders with quiet eyes. The Slytherin common room was empty except for them, everyone else likely having retired already, but that didn't stop Dazai from feeling claustrophobic under his new bandages. Blaze, though he must have been waiting some time, was still in his daily robes and looking presentable as ever. How annoying that Dazai could halt the panicked beating of his heart, but he couldn't make himself look as put together as Blaze could. Maybe it was the lack of expression. Right then, Blaze's face seemed to suggest he was thinking a great deal about what he had to say, where Dazai was sure his own face wasn't doing much more than looking tired. "Are you feeling better?" Blaze said after a moment, not moving from where he stood by the fireplace. His body was framed with firelight, and Dazai had to look away. "Aw, was Blaze worried about me?" "I still am." Dazai felt his cheeks dust over before he even registered what Blaze had said. He blinked owlishly for a moment, trying to keep the shock from showing on his face. The obvious show of affection gave Dazai pause. He pasted on a sloppy grin. You should be careful what you say. People might get the wrong idea about us." In response, Blaze's lips pursed together. "Everyone knows we're friends already, so I don't think that will be a problem. You can't just say things like that." The mafioso pouted, pink-faced and feeling flustered. He should have known. Blaze's expression was too serious, and his demeanor too genuine to be foiled by his jokes. "Not very nice," he finished lamely. "You've mentioned—" "Because it's true," Dazai grumbled, switching tracks. He walked a finger along the edge of the chess set. "The others went up to bed already, huh? I guess you're my most loyal subordinate after all." Blaze sighed, carefully trailing Dazai's fingers while they moved, as if their amble held some meaning. "There aren't really any benefits to being your subordinate, though. And it's all a bit confusing, considering you're Draco's subordinate, only in name. And Ron's, and the twins, he just hasn't realized it yet. Besides, it's a subtle takeover. In a few months, everyone will recognize me as their boss one way or another. Maybe. Anyway, I'm going to bed now. Don't have too much fun brooding in the dark, okay? I'm only out here to talk to you, so don't just run off like that. You drive a hard bargain. Fine, you can be my second in command once I get my gang put together. Good night, then." "Stop joking around," Blaze interrupted harshly. "I'm being serious." Dazai stilled. Even his fingers stopped their march across the board and came to rest beside a black bishop. "So am I. It's only a matter of time before I decide to get moving on this whole gang thing. Calling Draco boss will get boring soon, and—" "Dazai." "What?" Blaze's face was pressed together in a rare display of emotion, brows pinched, lips thin. It almost gave Dazai pause, because there wasn't any meaning beyond that surface-level emotion of concern. "You passed out today. Don't just brush that off like it's nothing. I'm worried about you." Dazai bit his lip, fingers twitching to scratch or pick at skin. What was it about these Hogwarts students that Dazai just didn't understand? Why was everyone doing this? This worried about his well-being, though they didn't benefit a single thing from keeping him healthy. And Ron's insistence that he was a good person, just lonely, it didn't make any sense. What were they all seeing that he wasn't? The twins including him in their pranks. The loyalty club trying to make him a better wizard. It was almost like they considered him a fellow human. He wasn't. He wasn't. Dazai's ability made sure of that, where his own personal downfalls couldn't add up. At first, he thought there must have been some ulterior motive in treating him kindly, but there wasn't. Something about it. Dazai felt sick, manipulating such genuine kindness. It confused him, left him wondering why he felt so at ease surrounded by these idiots. Mori wouldn't approve. It all made his head spin and his stomach clench. And Blaze's distressed frown now. "You're worrying about nothing," was what Dazai finally settled on, voice dangerously close to a growl. "Madame Pomfrey let me go, didn't she?" Blaze raised a brow. "That doesn't mean anything." His eyes flitted over Dazai's fingers up and a bandaged arm. Dazai dropped his arms to his side, letting his sleeve fall over his hands. It's just me. You know I don't care enough about anything to hold what happened against you. He paused. Then, almost tentatively, he added, Boss. Dazai blinked, pausing and feeling his lips quirk upwards. Calling me boss, that's high praise from someone like Blaze. Have I finally earned your loyalty? He chuckled, disarmed. You didn't have to earn anything, I'm just doing whatever I want. What a Blaze thing to say, Dazai hummed. He glanced to the chessboard. After a long considering moment, Dazai finally asked, Play with me? For a second, all Blaze did was stare. Finally, he sighed in a way that might have suggested either fondness or annoyance. Dazai could never be sure with Blaze. Sure, the boy said, crossing the room. I've been practicing, so don't expect to win as easily anymore. The bandages stretched over Dazai's skin when he grabbed his king piece, but it didn't stop him from smirking this time. I wouldn't count on that, if I were you. While he sat, Dazai pushed Pomfrey's snacks off to the side. White moves first. Blaze shot him a passive look before taking his seat at the table. He slid a white pawn towards the board's center. For someone so calculated, I'm surprised you always play black. Mori insists on playing white, Dazai said by way of answer, then countered with his own pawn. He couldn't remember a single time he had even been given the option to take white, and along with it the advantage of moving first. Doing so now just felt strange. The other boy hummed, but Dazai wasn't watching him to know what sort of expression he was wearing. At the wall, the fire crackled quietly to fill in the lull. Even with the flame blazing constantly, there was a perpetual chill to the Slytherin common room. Dazai shivered. Your turn. He blinked away from the fire and back to the chess set. While Dazai was considering his options, Blaze made a thoughtful sound. Draco was really worried too. In his own way. A black piece clicked down on the board. He kept threatening to sue someone. Blaze continued. I don't know what he thought he'd get out of doing that, considering none of the staff even knew we were practicing out there after class hours. But he was very emphatic about it. Ah, that does seem like him, Dazai admitted with a chuckle. It's your move. Blaze squinted down at the board for a moment, resting his cheek on a fisted hand thoughtfully. Even Pansy seemed worried. Maybe I finally won her over? Blaze gave him a look. Well, probably not. I can't really picture that sort of expression on Pansy's face anyway. I think she was mostly worried we'd get in trouble for pushing you too hard. Dazai paused. Did you? Blaze fingered a white knight on the board for a moment before deciding where to move it. When he set it back down, Blaze glanced up to meet Dazai's rust-colored eyes carefully. No. Oh, good. Cheerfully, he added, You're no use to me as a subordinate if you all have detention. Says the student with detentions every week. Blaze sighed. This sigh was decidedly quite fond. Dazai pouted and glared down at his rook. You're really not nice at all. Blaze laughed. It was a subdued thing, but it pulled at the corner of Dazai's lips regardless. Not a second later, however, Blaze grew serious once more. Dazai tried to hold on to the lopsided grin on his face, but it crumbled at the words, You haven't been eating. Dazai's blood froze. He felt watched, stared down, even though Blaze's eyes were still on the chessboard. There was an odd beating to his heart like his secrets were laid bare. The careful facade Dazai had built up around himself shattered for the second time that day. Not eating had never been such an ordeal before. With the Mafia, more than anything else, his lack of appetite had been encouraged. But now, here, a visit to the nurse, a professor's watchful eye, and now a friend's serious questioning. Dazai understood humans and their behavior intimately well. But all this, it had a foreign flavor. It's your turn, Dazai. Right. Dazai steeled himself up for a reply warily, even if he wasn't quite sure why he felt so defensive. So? Was all he managed to say. There was no use in denying it, really. When Dazai flipped through his memories of Blaze, it quickly became clear the boy wouldn't believe him if he insisted otherwise. Blaze had been watching him around food this whole time, Dazai realized belatedly. His stomach did a nervous flip. He'd been so focused on himself and his studies, Dazai hadn't given Blaze's watchful eye a second thought. Blindly, Dazai moved a piece across the board. I don't see the big deal. It's not like I'm dying from starvation, he tried to say with his expression, so who cares? Blaze hummed and pondered over his moves, while Dazai contemplated the merits of meeting the other snake's eyes. When Blaze finally glanced up from the board, Dazai was offering a sly smile to him. Just the sort of smile one can practice in a mirror. Who's going to run your gang if you spend all year in and out of the infirmary? Blaze intoned. His voice was just south of bored, which could mean any number of things for a person like Blaze. My loyal second-in-command? Dazai joked lightly, watching as the light of the fireplace turned Blaze's pawns a sickly orange color. It hurt his eyes more to look away. That won't happen again anyway. You're just going to get better. The Black King seemed to be watching him. The fireplace crackled loudly, and Dazai turned to face it. Welcome back, friend. 26 Blaze. Blaze, Dazai said, blinking. He tried not to sigh too loudly, but the other snake had always been adept at reading cues like that regardless, so there wasn't really a point. Can we do this tomorrow? Blaze looked over Dazai's tense shoulders with quiet eyes. The Slytherin common room was empty except for them, everyone else likely having retired already, but that didn't stop Dazai from feeling claustrophobic under his new bandages. Blaze, though he must have been waiting some time, was still in his daily robes and looking presentable as ever. How annoying that Dazai could halt the panicked beating of his heart, but he couldn't make himself look as put together as Blaze could. Maybe it was the lack of expression. Right then, Blaze's face seemed to suggest he was thinking a great deal about what he had to say, where Dazai was sure his own face wasn't doing much more than looking tired. Are you feeling better? Blaze said after a moment, not moving from where he stood by the fireplace. His body was framed with firelight, and Dazai had to look away. Oh, was Blaze worried about me? I still am. Dazai felt his cheeks dust over before he even registered what Blaze had said. He blinked owlishly for a moment, trying to keep the shock from showing on his face. The obvious show of affection gave Dazai pause. He pasted on a sloppy grin. You should be careful what you say. People might get the wrong idea about us. In response, Blaze's lips pursed together. Everyone knows we're friends already, so I don't think that will be a problem. You can't just say things like that. The mafioso pouted, pink-faced and feeling flustered. He should have known. Blaze's expression was too serious, and his demeanor too genuine to be foiled by his jokes. Not very nice, he finished lamely. You've mentioned. Because it's true, Dazai grumbled, switching tracks. He walked a finger along the edge of the chess set. The others went up to bed already, huh? I guess you're my most loyal subordinate after all. Blaze sighed, carefully trailing Dazai's fingers while they moved, as if their amble held some meaning. There aren't really any benefits to being your subordinate, though. And it's all a bit confusing, considering you're Draco's subordinate, only in name. And Ron's, and the twins, he just hasn't realized it yet. Besides, it's a subtle takeover. In a few months, everyone will recognize me as their boss one way or another. Maybe. Anyway, I'm going to bed now. Don't have too much fun brooding in the dark, okay? I'm only out here to talk to you, so don't just run off like that. You drive a hard bargain. Fine, you can be my second-in-command once I get my gang put together. Good night, then. Stop joking around. Blaze interrupted harshly. I'm being serious. Dazai stilled. Even his fingers stopped their march across the board and came to rest beside a black bishop. So am I. It's only a matter of time before I decide to get moving on this whole gang thing. Calling Draco boss will get boring soon, and... Dazai. What? Blaze's face was pressed together in a rare display of emotion, brows pinched, lips thin. It almost gave Dazai pause, because there wasn't any meaning beyond that surface-level emotion of concern. You passed out today. Don't just brush that off like it's nothing. I'm worried about you. Dazai bit his lip, fingers twitching to scratch or pick at skin. What was it about these Hogwarts students that Dazai just didn't understand? Why was everyone doing this? This worried about his well-being, though they didn't benefit a single thing from keeping him healthy. And Ron's insistence that he was a good person, just lonely, it didn't make any sense. What were they all seeing that he wasn't? The twins including him in their pranks. The loyalty club trying to make him a better wizard. It was almost like they considered him a fellow human. He wasn't. He wasn't. Dazai's ability made sure of that where his own personal downfalls couldn't add up. At first, he thought there must have been some ulterior motive in treating him kindly, but there wasn't. Something about it. Dazai felt sick, manipulating such genuine kindness. It confused him, left him wondering why he felt so at ease surrounded by these idiots. Mori wouldn't approve. It all made his head spin and his stomach clench. And Blaze's distressed frown now. "You're worrying about nothing," was what Dazai finally settled on, voice dangerously close to a growl. "Madame Pomfrey let me go, didn't she?" Blaze raised a brow. "That doesn't mean anything." His eyes flitted over Dazai's fingers up and a bandaged arm. Dazai dropped his arms to his side, letting his sleeve fall over his hands. "It's just me. You know I don't care enough about anything to hold what happened against you." He paused. Then, almost tentatively, he added, "Boss." Dazai blinked, pausing and feeling his lips quirk upwards. "Calling me boss, that's high praise from someone like Blaze. Have I finally earned your loyalty?" He chuckled, disarmed. "You didn't have to earn anything. I'm just doing whatever I want." "What a Blaze thing to say," Dazai hummed. He glanced to the chessboard. After a long considering moment, Dazai finally asked, "Play with me?" For a second, all Blaze did was stare. Finally, he sighed in a way that might have suggested either fondness or annoyance. Dazai could never be sure with Blaze. "Sure," the boy said, crossing the room. "I've been practicing, so don't expect to win as easily anymore." The bandages stretched over Dazai's skin when he grabbed his king piece, but it didn't stop him from smirking this time. "I wouldn't count on that, if I were you." While he sat, Dazai pushed Pomfrey's snacks off to the side. White moves first. Blaze shot him a passive look before taking his seat at the table. He slid a white pawn towards the board's center. "For someone so calculated, I'm surprised you always play black." "Mori insists on playing white," Dazai said by way of answer, then countered with his own pawn. He couldn't remember a single time he had even been given the option to take white, and along with it the advantage of moving first. Doing so now just felt strange. The other boy hummed, but Dazai wasn't watching him to know what sort of expression he was wearing. At the wall, the fire crackled quietly to fill in the lull. Even with the flame blazing constantly, there was a perpetual chill to the Slytherin common room. Dazai shivered. "Your turn." He blinked away from the fire and back to the chess set. While Dazai was considering his options, Blaze made a thoughtful sound. Draco was really worried too. In his own way. A black piece clicked down on the board. "He kept threatening to sue someone," Blaze continued. "I don't know what he thought he'd get out of doing that, considering none of the staff even knew we were practicing out there after class hours. But he was very emphatic about it." "Ah, that does seem like him," Dazai admitted with a chuckle. "It's your move." Blaze squinted down at the board for a moment, resting his cheek on a fisted hand thoughtfully. Even Pansy seemed worried. "Maybe I finally won her over?" Blaze gave him a look. "Well, probably not. I can't really picture that sort of expression on Pansy's face anyway. I think she was mostly worried we'd get in trouble for pushing you too hard." Dazai paused. "Did you?" Blaze fingered a white knight on the board for a moment before deciding where to move it. When he set it back down, Blaze glanced up to meet Dazai's rust-colored eyes carefully. "No. Oh, good." Cheerfully, he added, "You're no use to me as a subordinate if you all have detention. Says the student with detentions every week." Blaze sighed. This sigh was decidedly quite fond. Dazai pouted and glared down at his rook. "You're really not nice at all." Blaze laughed. It was a subdued thing, but it pulled at the corner of Dazai's lips regardless. Not a second later, however, Blaze grew serious once more. Dazai tried to hold on to the lopsided grin on his face, but it crumbled at the words, "You haven't been eating." Dazai's blood froze. He felt watched, stared down, even though Blaze's eyes were still on the chessboard. There was an odd beating to his heart, like his secrets were laid bare. The careful facade Dazai had built up around himself shattered for the second time that day. Not eating had never been such an ordeal before. With the Mafia, more than anything else, his lack of appetite had been encouraged. But now, here, a visit to the nurse, a professor's watchful eye, and now a friend's serious questioning. Dazai understood humans and their behavior intimately well. But all this, it had a foreign flavor. "It's your turn, Dazai." "Right." Dazai steeled himself up for a reply warily, even if he wasn't quite sure why he felt so defensive. "So?" was all he managed to say. There was no use in denying it, really. When Dazai flipped through his memories of Blaze, it quickly became clear the boy wouldn't believe him if he insisted otherwise. Blaze had been watching him around food this whole time, Dazai realized belatedly. His stomach did a nervous flip. He'd been so focused on himself and his studies, Dazai hadn't given Blaze's watchful eye a second thought. Blindly, Dazai moved a piece across the board. "I don't see the big deal. It's not like I'm dying from starvation," he tried to say with his expression, "so who cares?" Blaze hummed and pondered over his moves, while Dazai contemplated the merits of meeting the other snake's eyes. When Blaze finally glanced up from the board, Dazai was offering a sly smile to him. Just the sort of smile one can practice in a mirror. "Who's going to run your gang if you spend all year in and out of the infirmary?" Blaze intoned. His voice was just south of bored, which could mean any number of things for a person like Blaze. "My loyal second-in-command?" Dazai joked lightly, watching as the light of the fireplace turned Blaze's pawns a sickly orange color. It hurt his eyes more to look away. "That won't happen again anyway. You're just going to get better at hiding that you aren't eating, right? That's not a solution." "Ah. Blaze is no fair, cornering me like this." Blaze sighed. His voice was tinged with an odd sort of concern, but the move of his rook across the board was confident. He'd lose within the next few moves. Blaze must have known that. "I wouldn't have to do this if you weren't such an idiot boss." Dazai's next turn was a quick one. "You are mean." The mafioso grumbled half-heartedly. "I'm glad your paper blew away." "Sure. As if I care about getting a 0 in Quirrell's class." Most of the board was stacked against Blaze. There was really no hope for him now, but his pieces forged onward regardless. What did Madame Pomfrey have to say? "Eat more. You and her have a lot in common like that." It's annoying, among other things which Blaze certainly did not need to know about. Just thinking about it made the cotton on Dazai's arms weigh heavier on him. Curiously, she hadn't really pushed him on the topic. So long as Dazai kept his mouth shut, neither would Blaze. "She's right, of course." Blaze nodded. Dazai blinked. He glanced between Blaze and the White King with a look of uncomprehending blankness. "Checkmate." "Shame." Blaze flicked his king, knocking it over with a woody sound. He didn't sound upset in the slightest. Instead, Blaze's tone was almost amused. "I lost. Eat something before you go to bed, boss." Without wasting another second, Blaze stood. He waved a hand over his head before retreating to the bedroom where all the other Slytherin students were already fast asleep. The fireplace crackled quietly at his side in Blaze's wake. And he was gone just like that, leaving Dazai alone with his thoughts once again. He breathed out heavily for only an audience of half-crumpled chess pieces. They didn't rise to his aid. Dazai picked up Blaze's fallen king and rolled it between his fingers. It was woody and light, and somehow not at all the black king Dazai usually played. He set it back down with a click and went about resetting the table. Once every piece was back in its place, however, there was nothing left to distract from Blaze's words. From Pomfrey's gift sitting across from him at the table, a new opponent. This one Dazai couldn't talk down with a clever play of his black knight. He almost reached out to take it. There was a skitter of tiny feet on stone. Dazai startled awake from his thoughts, eyes shooting off for the source of the unexpected sound. It was too small of a sound to be another student, but that didn't rule out magical creatures. Surely if a troll could get in, Angel's beady, amethyst eye stared right back into his. "Oh." Dazai felt himself relax minutely. "It's just Ron's creepy rat." Louder, he added, "Your owner's been looking for you, you know." It watched him in unblinking silence and frightening stillness. Angel always seemed to be smiling beneath that layer of sleek black fur. Unfortunately, it seemed the rat hadn't been eaten by owls after all. It was sat on the floor, some distance away from Dazai's feet. Tiny black claws fit neatly into the grooves of the tiles. Angel's wide purple eyes seemed to take in everything and nothing at once, and the burn of firelight turned its whole body a gross shade of red. Dazai rolled his eyes. "Get out of here, shitty demon rat." Angel scampered away without needing to be told twice. Creepy little thing. Dazai shook the odd encounter from his thoughts, with a silent reminder to bother Ron about keeping his pet on a tighter leash. With a huff, he finally reached across the table to root around inside Pomfrey's bag. the brief interaction with Angel oddly waking him from his foggy thoughts. It was stuffed full of crackers and cookies and the bandages he had stolen. Dazai drew out a small package of chocolate chip cookies. The little black chips looked like eyes. "Shame," he mocked, lip curled in distaste as he dropped them back into the bag. Dazai stood. That sort of thing would just be too sweet. He pinched the Black King's crown between his fingers, frowning down at it. The king was really worthless without its army, but it was even worse off without Dazai's guidance. Stupid little wooden things. He flicked it over, just to hear it roll across the table and clatter onto the floor. 27, the problem child. You killed a troll, congratulations. But please try not to have too much fun while you're away, Dazai. When you come home, there won't be any beasts to kill for you to keep occupied. I hope mafia traders will suffice. You would look so adorable breaking someone's fingers while wearing that red dress. Dazai crumbled up the letter and stuffed it into his book bag. Every eye dotted with a heart, the complimentary doodles by Elise, the faint odor of sweets and antiseptic sticking to the ink. These letters never got any easier to read. The dismissive tone alone was enough to curl Dazai's lip to his nose in disgust. Across the table, Ron watched him cautiously. Bad news? Mori's just being useless as always. Right. The only good thing to come from Mori's latest missive was the hastily scrawled, "Please control your owl." That was infinitely satisfying. Whatever Featherbrain had done to garner such a response from the doctor was entirely worth having to read about all the frilly dresses waiting for him back in Yokohama. That horrible bird deserved a reward for its troubles. Maybe Ron would volunteer Angel as bird food if Dazai asked nice enough. Are you sure it's okay for you to work with us? I wouldn't call what I'm doing working. Dazai yawned. But I wouldn't be here if I didn't think I could get away with it. At the very least, Ron hissed under his breath, motioning vaguely to the full classroom. Don't you remember Rule 1? That's 2 of the 3 rules you've broken now. Hermione perked up beside them form where her nose had been stuffed into her defense against the dark arts textbook. Somehow, she had managed to blend irritation and concern into one look. Please, you two. We have to finish this assignment before class is over if we also want to have time to write the potions essay later today. Ron raised a brow. You know Dazai isn't going to do either assignment, Maione. And aren't you the one always worrying about him being bullied? Oh, Dazai interrupted pleasantly. He spared a lazy glance to where Blaze, Draco, and Pansy were huddled over their textbooks at the other side of the classroom. They actually said it was okay to work with you all today. They did? Even Hermione turned away from her work. That doesn't sound like something Draco would just do. He beamed. Maybe I'm growing on him. Which was at least partially true after the events of Halloween. And for all intents and purposes, Draco did prefer when Dazai stuck with Slytherins and avoided Gryffindors at all costs. Not that Malfoy had any semblance of control over what the mafioso did, of course. But that was neither here nor there. What had actually transpired between the Loyalty Club that morning was this. It wasn't 5 minutes after Dazai had sat down in the Great Hall that Draco and Pansy surrounded him. So, what happened yesterday? Why did you pass out? Draco clarified in a shout far too loud for the early morning. Dazai glanced ablaze, surprised to find only a casual shrug in return. He hadn't said anything about Dazai starving himself to the others. His lips quirked into a smile. Madame Pomfrey didn't tell you? He put a hand to his heart, playing dramatic. You're working me too hard, boss. She said you need to give me more breaks, and also that you should do my homework. She didn't say that. Silently, while Draco spoke, Blaze slid a piece of toast across the table. Dazai took it with only some reluctance and a pout pasted on his face. Well, Dazai shrugged. Not that last part at least. Still, I'm taking a break from the Loyalty Club today, since the nurse said you lot are no good for me. Draco's brow twitched. She didn't say that either. Who are you going to work with in class then? Pansy sneered, not at all bothered by Dazai's announcement. No one else in Slytherin will even talk to you. Hence the change in company, because contrary to Pansy's low opinion of him, Dazai did have a few connections outside of Slytherin. The fact that Draco hadn't charged over yet to pull him away from Ron and Hermione was about as close to permission as Dazai was going to get. Besides, what was the worst Draco could do to him? Nothing at Hogwarts really stacked up to Port Mafia, especially with respect to punishment. Who cares why I'm over here anyway? Dazai whined after a moment. You love hanging out with me. Ron flushed, turning from him to Hermione with a look that made Dazai smirk. I like your owl more than you. Its name is Featherbrain, Ron. No, it's not, he groaned. The book he'd been skimming was all but forgotten now. How is she doing, anyway? Last time I was visiting the owlery, she wasn't there. Ugh. Dazai sunk lower in his seat at the reminder. Featherbrain, he emphasized jokingly, is back now, with Maury's letter, unfortunately. Just take the stupid owl from me already. Maybe Maury will think it died and he'll stop trying to send me things. Hermione perked up from her assignment. Quill stalled over the 5th page of her essay. A parent. I know my folks are worried about me being in such a foreign place. She blinked. Now please work on your assignment. Instead of humoring her with a reply, Dazai yawned. He tried not to bristle at Hermione's words, but succeeded only in not flinching away like he'd been hit. Talking about Maury and about parents never ceased to put him ill at ease. Dazai was certain his father had never felt anything like concern for him, not like Hermione had meant, at least. Things were best like that, though. Dazai cleared his throat mutely, but that didn't dislodge the tight feeling growing there. Ron sent him a sideways look before turning back to his own assignment. Hermione really was a good influence on the redhead. Still, he only half-heartedly flipped through the pages of his Dada textbook, and his paper certainly wasn't the 5 pages the bushy-haired girl was currently boasting. Dazai's own book was left back in his dorm. No use lugging that thing around when he'd already read it cover to cover. And thanks to Dazai's near-perfect memory, the book itself was rendered almost entirely useless to him now. It had been an interesting read, but not especially practical to him. After all, the only defense to dark magic Dazai needed was his own hand and the sting of no longer human. Speaking of no longer human, Dazai let his gaze flit over the heads of every student in the room before finally settling on where Professor Quirrell was grading papers with 2 shaking hands. The professors were an interesting problem. It was hard not to notice, really, the way their eyes seemed to linger over crowds of students and remain over anyone who spoke with a too loud voice. They were still looking for who had killed the troll. They were looking for him. But claiming the kill wasn't functional for Dazai, not yet. Not now, when he still wasn't sure how abilities fit into the magic community. Not now, when this secret was only making him a more integral member of Slytherin. Certainly not now, when there was still such an important piece of that whole situation missing. Why was the troll on the 3rd floor? It had been bugging him ever since Halloween, but Dazai had been too preoccupied with Slytherin politics and that nasty headache to bother with an investigation. But Pomfrey's intervention yesterday had shifted the balance a bit. Draco was more than willing to give him a break of practicing magic for a few days in light of her warning, and even his headache had faded somewhat. With the 2 biggest distractions momentarily taken care of, he could finally investigate what had happened during the Halloween feast. Dazai's cinnamon eyes flicked off of Quirrell, not wanting to be caught staring. The panicked shout of, "Troll in the dungeon," echoed in his head. How would the troll get from the dungeons to the 3rd floor so quickly? Dazai wasn't willing to discount that it was possible, given how little he understood of how to navigate Hogwarts, but Hermione had theorized that the mountain troll was drawn to Hogwarts due to the increase in magic at the time. But if that were the case, wouldn't it have gone from the dungeons to the Great Hall, where everyone was gathered? Why bypass the source of its meal in exchange for the empty classrooms on the 3rd floor? That line of reasoning just didn't add up. So why did Professor Quirrell find the troll in the dungeons? Dazai's nose scrunched up in thought. He turned to Hermione when the sound of quills scratching over paper didn't clarify any answer. She was just starting in on the 6th page of her essay. Meanwhile, a glance revealed Ron had barely dented his first. "Hey," Dazai said after a pause, "what do you 2 think about Professor Quirrell?" Ron set his quill down, immediately focused on this new conversation like it was a lifeline. He pushed his textbook away. "He's all right, I suppose. He used to teach Muggle studies, you know, I hear. He was a lot better at it, too." "Really? Apparently he took a sabbatical last year and came back a stuttering mess," Ron whispered conspiratorially. "That's what my brothers say, at least." Suddenly, Hermione sighed. She glared over at them from her work. "You'd know some of this if you stayed awake during class, Dazai. Professor Quirrell talks about his trips all the time. A bit more than he should, to be honest. The textbook doesn't cover half of the things he goes on about." "Huh." Dazai hummed, blatantly ignoring Hermione's barb while leaning into his palm. I wonder what happened. Maybe Professor Quirrell ran into some foreign mafia while out traveling. That would explain the dangerous vibe Dazai got from him as well as the stuttering. He knew from first-hand experience that involvement with the mafia tended to leave people shaken. Or maybe that was just the people Dazai himself got to interrogate. The way Dazai saw it, there were two possibilities for why the ever-anxious Quirrell would report he found the troll in the dungeons. He was telling the truth, and the mountain troll had wandered to the 3rd floor for some strange reason. It was possible, considering how many secret passages it could have taken to get up that far. Dazai would have to ask Fred and George about that. If this were true, it would potentially explain why students weren't allowed in that part of the castle. The staff must be keeping something powerful up there that was potent enough to draw in magical beasts. Or the alternative, he was lying. The troll had never been in the dungeons and Quirrell had some unknown motivation to cause panic during the Halloween feast. Dazai couldn't entirely look past this option. No matter how many times Blaze rolled his eyes, he would stick to the fact that Quirrell oozed danger like a second skin. But what was there to gain from sending all the staff down to the dungeons? Unless there was something he needed to do secretly on one of the higher floors. Could it be a little bit of both? Dazai mused lightly. He spared another quick glance to Quirrell. Chuckling to himself, the mafioso let his head fall into his arms on the desk. I should take a sabbatical too. From what? Ron snorted. Hermione nodded affirmation but didn't lift her head from the book. You can't take a break if you were never working. I'll take a nice vacation from the land of the living then. Maybe I'll enjoy a swim in the river Styx. He felt Hermione's vexed huff more than heard it. Dazai turned to Ron. Speaking of the underworld, I saw your rat yesterday, Ron. You should keep a closer eye on it. Ron perked up. Angel, you found him? In the Slytherin common room. Dazai nodded lazily. It went there just to taunt me. I haven't seen him in weeks. I was starting to think Mrs. Norris ate him. Despite all the time Dazai spent wandering the halls of Hogwarts, he'd actually had very few interactions with the caretaker Filch and his cat, Mrs. Norris. Still, the image of Angel being eaten wasn't an entirely unpleasant one. One can only dream. Oi, the Weasley grumbled, when he didn't look too put off. Dazai smirked. Dazai's gaze flicked back to Quirrell. Dazai spotted Professor Quirrell coming towards them a few seconds before the man arrived, and his smile stuck in place like it had been glued together hastily. He watched the man approach with a certain degree of practiced surprise. It wouldn't do to give away that he had, in fact, been monitoring the strange professor all class period. Beside him, Ron jolted into action over his essay, probably in hopes to look busy. A hand landed on his shoulder. Working hard, you three? Professor Quirrell stuttered. The professor's shivering hand had settled down on the folded black cloth of his cloak in a light pat. He must have noticed how Dazai froze up under the touch because the hand pulled off almost immediately. Dazai blinked two thinned eyes up at the turban-wearing teacher. A cursory glance told him that Quirrell hadn't made any rounds to the other students, which meant he'd sought out someone in Dazai's group intentionally. Curious, and definitely suspicious in light of Dazai's current line of thinking regarding the defense against the dark arts professor. It was probably for the best that Hermione answered before the mafioso could. Yes, sir. I'm almost finished with the first half now, actually. Quirrell's eyes dropped to the 6 full pages spread out in front of Hermione, with an impressive amount of trepidation, even by his own standards. Well, there's no harm in being concise, you know, Eminem's Granger. But that would hardly express the complexities of the Verdimillious charm, Professor. Dazai snorted, drawing their attention to himself. It's not that complicated. It is too. She stabbed a finger into her textbook as if to emphasize her point. Dazai only raised a brow, not even bothering to spare a glance at the text. He'd read it already. The Verdimillious charm was not that complicated. Certainly not complicated enough to warrant 6 whole pages worth of analysis. What was she even writing there anyway? You've never even successfully cast it. That doesn't mean anything, Hermione. I've never successfully cast anything. He heard Ron sigh. Don't say that so proudly, mate. Actually, Professor Quirrell interjected, looking a bit overwhelmed by where the conversation had gone without him. That is something I was hoping to talk with you about, Mr. Dazai. 28 Dazai accidentally gets adopted. Dazai sighed, practically melting into the table with the force of his exhaustion. remedial lessons with Professor Quirrell. After his remedial lesson with the Loyalty Club, and just after all this nonsense about overworking himself, too, maybe he should tell Madame Pomfrey and she'd make everyone leave him alone, since they're just going to pester him over being his able to do magic or not. Thinking about how invasive she had been last time, though, Dazai shook his head. Definitely not, then. Apparently, his overall lack of magical skill was finally reaching a point of recognition. I'm worried that you'll fail, Mr. Dazai, Quirrell had said, so I would like for you to attend some RR remedial lessons with me starting this week. Dazai huffed. And Quirrell of all professors, literally the one person in this school Dazai was most suspicious of, reached out to help him. He wasn't sure whether to feel threatened or amused. Threatened, because Quirrell might actually be bad news, in which case him keeping a closer eye on Dazai could only spell trouble. Or amused, because this certainly gave him an opportunity to scope out the Halloween situation firsthand. Well, maybe it was a little bit of both. Regardless, it was an interesting situation to be in for sure. Dazai thought about writing as much to Mori, but in the end had decided to hold back. He had some time before his next letter was scheduled. A lot could change in even such a small amount of time. Or not. But any time spent not writing to Dr. Mori was time well spent. In the meantime, Dazai put his efforts into reading up in the library. Magic lessons with the Loyalty Club were one thing. Dazai could easily blame his lack of magic ability on incompetence, or even just citing that he was a Muggleborn. With how rampant Muggleborn prejudice was in Slytherin, Draco and Pansy accepted that line of reasoning without much complaint at all. But magic lessons with a professor were an entirely different beast. Dazai could only hide so much under the eyes of a trained wizard. Surely Professor Quirrell would eventually notice that Dazai wasn't failing at spells so much as completely incapable of doing them, right? Dazai didn't know how to feel at the prospect of Quirrell knowing about No Longer Human. At least not while these books still had nothing to offer him on the subject. With a long sigh, Dazai shook his head. One thing at a time. Lucky for Dazai, he'd convinced Draco to give him a few more days off of Loyalty Club lessons by paraphrasing some of Pomfrey's worried drivel from the other day. For now, however, Dazai was hunched over a massive blue book in the library, surrounded by blossoming towers of other tomes he had selected. While there were a few works focused on the subject of magical creatures around him, Dazai was content with what he knew now. He didn't need to know what types of creatures there were, just why he could kill them with a touch. For now, Hermione's explanation seemed to check out. Although his readings had revealed the rather humorous fact that some considered humans to be magical beasts rather than beings, which Dazai had found infinitely amusing. The book he was currently digging through discussed some of the more complex theories behind magical incantation and spellcasting. Though nearly 300 pages in with no mention of special abilities, Dazai was still optimistic that it would prove its worth somehow. He flipped a page, eagerly kicking his feet under the table. The theory here was interesting. Incredibly so. It had laid out the basics of what was taught in class. But it hadn't just stopped there. No. Everything discussed in the book perfectly described what Dazai had been feeling all along. Every time No Longer Human reacted to nearby spellcasting, he was feeling how latent magic in the atmosphere reacted to the flick of a wand and a muttered word. And the book propped open before him was describing it in such perfect detail that Dazai was able to mentally return to his previous experiences with others' magic and dissect exactly what they had done. He was almost looking forward to class on Monday, if only just to experience it again with this new knowledge. What Dazai found to be perplexing, however, was that everything in the book was strictly theoretical. Wizards seemed to understand in general that they possessed the ability to manipulate this magical energy, but the mechanics of how were entirely guesswork for them. With No Longer Human, however, Dazai could feel every shift, every push and pull, every spark that indicated the incantation of a spell. If only he wasn't nullifying everything he touched, Dazai would know exactly how to shape a spell. Any spell, really. Dazai wondered how much better wizards could be at magic if they could only just feel what he could feel. If they could only just sense the magical mechanics of their casting, certainly wizards could twist it however they liked outside of the constraints of wand-waving and pseudo-Latin speaking. Damn. Dazai would have made a great wizard. But still, no say on how abilities factored into the magical community. It was almost annoying that there was absolutely no mention of abilities in any of the texts he'd read so far. Nothing. Sure, the magical community was relatively hidden from the world as a whole, but the phenomenon of special abilities was hardly disguised. With all the ruckus most ability-oriented organizations made, there should at least be some mention, right? Dazai shook off the thought with a rather literal flick of his wrist to turn the page. At the top of the page, in bolded letters, it read, "The Fundamental Laws of Magic." However, just moments before Dazai could read any further, a pair of hushed shouts stole his attention. The unexpected noise shocked him out of his relative peace, racking a flinch through Dazai's body, with enough force that he accidentally slammed the book shut. When he turned up from the desk, Dazai was immediately met with two matching sets of intense auburn stares. He tried not to startle back, but it was difficult with how quickly they approached him, almost as if a fire was lit on the soles of their feet. Fred and George. "Hello, what's wrong?" Something must have been amiss if their searching gazes were any indication. A prank went wrong, and they were hoping he would cover them. Filch hot on their tails? Dazai glanced around them but didn't see any staff except for the librarian's desk near to library doors. The twins each looked him up and down with unflinching scrutiny. Uncomprehending, Dazai's nose scrunched up. "Why are you two looking at me like that?" The Weasleys shared a look before taking a step back. Dazai let out a breath he hadn't realized he'd taken in, but noted that the frame of worry still held their shoulders straight. How curious. Dazai let his confusion show on his face. "Are you okay?" Dazai blinked away from them at the sudden intensity of two voices shouting at once. Then he frowned. "As fine as I can be. Why?" George hovered over him, fretting. "We heard you were in the eye infirmary." "What happened?" Fred finished. "What?" It took a second for the words to register in Dazai's brain. When it did, his lips grew thin. Dazai tried to keep his voice pleasant when he asked, "Who did you hear that from?" Not that it wasn't true, obviously, but it was curious that the twins should find out. He hadn't thought anyone in the loyalty club would blab about what had happened, especially considering that Dazai had been telling them it was their fault for overworking him. And if any of the other Slytherins had overheard, somehow, they definitely wouldn't be motivated to tell a Gryffindor anything. "Not Madame Pomfrey," he said after a moment. One twin started and the other finished hastily. "Word gets around. Especially to us." Dazai willed the expression on his face to fall flat. "They're lying." His brain supplied without prompting. "Why?" "I was in the infirmary Thursday," he answered honestly. Then carefully he added, "Professor Snape has been badgering me to get that cut on my arm looked at. I finally found my way over there, is all." Madame Pomfrey looked it over. It was, technically, the truth. And Dazai could tell from the way the fight drained out of the twins that they believed it too. No mention of his malnourishment. No mention of his other cuts. Perfect. Just the sort of lie by omission that even Mori might fall for if Dazai was careful enough with his delivery. The Mafia member gave himself a mental pat on the back. Just thinking about the other night had his cuts singing underneath their new rough bandaging. Dazai scratched his wrist while the twins silently deliberated. After a moment they seemed to come to a suitable conclusion, relief. It was a little jarring, actually, to see that expression directed at him. Relief said, "I'm glad you aren't hurt in a way that went beyond the succeeding because you're useful to me." No. This expression before Dazai now lacked all of the affect of possessiveness that was so familiar. Had Mori ever felt this type of relief when he realized Dazai wasn't hurt too badly? Did Father? Dazai? Dazai startled out of his thoughts with a blink. What? Oh. Oops. Without realizing, he hadn't stopped scratching at his wrist. While Dazai's thoughts wandered away from him, he'd only started picking at the dry skin there with more intensity. The thought had him sharpening his nails deeper in the flesh of his scarred arm absently. There wasn't a reason for it. He just happened to dig deeper into his flesh when thinking about going home. Dazai's nails broke through the pale skin of his bird-thin wrist and had welled up with blood. He drew the offending limb back like he'd been stabbed. In a way, he had. A few stray drops of crimson snaked out of the claw marks, but Dazai quickly wiped them away. Dazai shot a numb look to the twins, if only just to see what sort of expression they were wearing. The relief was gone from their faces, replaced by matching sets of wide eyes. The concern was palpable there, the worry, the panic. Before they could start floundering over him, Dazai did what Dazai did best, Well, that's unfortunate. He told a joke. It was actually kind of hard to joke about accidentally scratching your arm open, though. He didn't even think the wound was deep enough to warrant a joke about suicide. Anyway, Dazai tucked his wrist beneath his sleeve and hid it behind his back as if that would lessen the offense. He offered a smile just south of. Genuine. Was there something else you two needed? Another shared look between the twins. Another message flying right over Dazai's curly-haired head. George was the first to speak. Okay, can we backtrack, like 5 seconds? I don't think that's necessary. Dazai wasn't sure if he succeeded in keeping the vague embarrassment from his voice. He certainly wasn't keeping the pink tint off of his cheeks. Fred made an almost offended sound. Actually, I think that's a great idea. Are you okay? Please let me see your hand. George insisted. I know the healing spell, hold on, healing spell. Healing spell, oh. What was it? A pisky? Whatever the verbal cast was, it wasn't going to work. Snape had already proved that well enough during their trip to Diagon Alley. Fantastic. He should definitely stop them before they actually try to heal his new wound, but damn if Dazai didn't want to feel them cast the spell now that he knew what to focus on. Dazai chuckled weakly, dodging to the left when George tried to move around him. Fine, it's fine. It's not fine, they said as one. You're bleeding. Only a little. And be quiet, we're in the library. More than that, he didn't want Madame Pince coming over and seeing him like this. I'll wrap it up later, if it's even still bleeding. Just tell me why you were looking for me. It wasn't just about Thursday, was it? How annoying. The sting of his open wrist drew the whole conversation into heightened focus. Fred puffed his cheeks out and planted his hands firmly on his hips. Meanwhile, George's obvious concern didn't abate in the slightest. Nope, no can do, Snakey. There's no distracting us from this one. George nodded seriously. Hand out, please. There were actually quite a few things Dazai could do to distract them, not in the slightest limited to lying, sweet-talking, and punching one of them in the face. But, for some reason, that sort of thing made his stomach turn. Dazai wasn't sure what sort of feeling that was, but he didn't like the idea of hurting the twins like that. Now that he was thinking about it, Dazai was really quite fond of them, wasn't he? Gross. That thought, more so than any other, turned his intestines inside out. It steeled any reservations he might have had. Fond. No, Dazai wasn't fond of anyone. He felt sick at the revelation. Actually, he said, voice low, I'm not feeling well. Can we do this later? No. Dazai eyed the twins with an empty glare, defensive. Drop it. His tone was certain and sharp, the sort of tone you might use on a rowdy subordinate. Fred and George weren't his subordinates in the slightest, but they were entirely out of line. He cleared his throat. Did you need information for a prank? If not, I'll be leaving now. A stolen glance between Fred and George indicated another silent conversation. Dazai only watched with a blank look. The twins had never called him boss, had never sworn loyalty, had nothing to gain from fretting over him. It was curious as much as it was revolting. At least when Dr. Mori cleaned Dazai's wounds, he had the decency to make his motives obvious. At least Dazai was useful to him. I guess not then. Dazai, George interrupted before the young mafioso could storm off. I don't know what you're thinking, but stop. If you don't want us looking at that, at least let us walk you to the infirmary. Merlin knows you'll get lost if we don't. Ah, Dazai blinked, feeling his morbid thoughts disperse abruptly. I'm not really hurt. Then, shyly, he mumbled. It was an accident anyway, and I just went the other day. The twins looked relieved again. It was a different type of relief this time. And now you're going again? Come on. They each held out an arm to him, looping their elbows together to practically lift Dazai away from the desk. Dazai tensed under their hold, finding he couldn't break free without hurting one of them. The idea rankled. Because he was so much smaller than the twins, Dazai was easily carried along. They carted him straight from the library. I was reading, you know. What about all of my books? He sputtered. But the fight had mostly left him, replaced by an overwhelming befuddlement with the latest turn of events. Madame Pince will put them away. Or Hermione will come and scavenge them later. Whichever comes first. Being pulled down the hall by a serious pair of Weasley twins was starting to draw eyes from other students. A mix of perplexed, amused, and vaguely concerned stares followed them across campus. Dazai felt himself wanting to duck away under all the looks. He couldn't do that. But he did shuffle further behind the twins. Dazai caught Fred's smirk at the movement and refused to be embarrassed. After what felt like a too long time under that many stairs, they finally arrived at the infirmary. The twins wasted no time in guiding him through the door. It looked the same as it had 2 nights before, just as obnoxiously bright. He didn't feel quite as panicked as he had then, though. Now he was mostly feeling numb. Good. Neither Fred nor George had released their holds on him just yet. "Madame Pomfrey," Fred called. "You remember Dazai, don't you?" Just as he spoke, the matron appeared from behind a bed curtain. Her face was pressed together in something like amusement or concern. "Dazai, oh, did you need something, dear? Perhaps more snacks?" Dazai bristled at the mention, but George spoke over his discomfort. He scraped his arm. "Could you give him a talking to about getting help when he needs it, please? I don't think our favorite little snake is willing to listen to us. Definitely amusement and concern. Somehow both, really." Without hesitation, Madame Pomfrey rushed forward to make room for Dazai on the cot. The twins guided him to it, despite Dazai grumbled protests. Pomfrey must have spotted the blood, because she was already inspecting his wounded, bony wrist, before Dazai had registered sitting down. "Oh, hun." The matron sighed, voice soft and disgusting. Dazai tensed up when she began to wipe the blood clear. "You're very troublesome, you know," Fred said lightly. Then George continued. "You don't have any older siblings, do you?" Dazai blinked, lost. "No?" A hand wiped down his arm. The pressure burned like nothing else. Pomfrey was being too soft. Dazai tried not to think about it, to focus on anything else. Flinching now, under all these eyes, wasn't an option. He pulled a shaky smile onto his lips and kept his gaze locked somewhere between Fred and the matron. "It shows." George nodded, like that meant something. "You need a big brother to watch out for you. This is the 2nd time you've been bleeding since we met." "Only 2? Dazai tried to mimic that joking tone. Madame Pomfrey answered for the twins. "That's enough of that now. 2 times is plenty." Fred clearly agreed. He and his brother were a constant hovering presence over Dazai's shoulders, and the matron was hunched warmly over his wound. It was a strange feeling, to be surrounded without being afraid. He wondered what Maury was up to these days. 29 Verdimilius. "Sorry, I can't." Ron blinked. He looked somewhere between offended and curious before finally settling on suspicious. Knowing Dazai's track record, that was probably a fair assessment. He crossed his arms and puffed out his cheeks petulantly. Dazai offered the redhead an apologetic, if fake, look. "You'll have to visit Featherbrain without me. I know it can be tough, spending time apart, but I'm sure you can manage." "Oi," Ron barked. Then, almost subdued, he asked, "What's keeping you busy anyway? Not some chore one of those nasty Slytherin has for you, I hope." "Ah, nothing like that, really." When the Weasley clearly wasn't satisfied with such a general answer, Dazai laughed. "My extra special bonus lessons with Professor Quirrell start today." "Oh. Good luck with that. I'm glad he's not just taking anyone for extra lessons." Dazai chuckled. He patted his book bag, feeling for his wand in there. "Just for those of us who have never cast any spells, I'm afraid." After a pause, he added, "He'll get sick of me eventually. Until then, you'll have to keep Featherbrain entertained yourself, well, barring his trips to deliver Maury letters." Ron deflated a bit at the explanation. "Maybe if you actually put a bit of effort into your spellcasting, you'll be free in no time. But I guess you're just going to laze around, aren't you?" Actually, that was one of the problems Dazai was currently debating with himself. He couldn't do magic, so slacking off during class was exceptionally beneficial. This way, he gave off the appearance of someone who couldn't bother to try, rather than someone who probably shouldn't have been accepted into Hogwarts in the first place. But one-on-one lessons with Quirrell posed a certain threat to that persona. He'd have to do something during their lessons. It was really just a question of what. His current plan involved recalling some of his readings and hoping for the best. Worst-case scenario, Professor Quirrell realized that Dazai didn't have magic, and he got expelled. Dazai would get to laugh in Maury's face. Hogwarts wouldn't have to deal with him. It was kind of a win-win, but so was getting to stick around a bit longer away from home. Dazai shrugged, smiling emptily. "I have to go now. You're welcome to steal Featherbrain while I'm gone, of course." "Just go already," Ron laughed. "I already know you're going to get lost on the way. Better get a head start, mate." In return, the mafioso merely smiled. That much was true, of course. He waved pleasantly as Ron turned off in the direction of the owlery. It wasn't until the red head was around the corner that Dazai dropped his hand to his side. How tedious. Remedial lessons. At least Dazai was looking forward to talking with the only other person to have seen the mountain troll alive outside of Dazai himself and Draco. Currently, Professor Quirrell was the only unknown in that equation. How interesting, Dazai thought to himself. He twirled on his toes and began walking in the opposite direction Ron had. And dangerous. But that thought didn't lessen his excitement. The thrill of the unknown only made Dazai's trip to Quirrell's office a quicker one, as he eagerly hurried through the halls. Dazai hugged the wall. He was quite fortunate to know the Weasley twins because, there it was. There was a slightly yellow stone on the wall that, if pushed just right, opened up a secret door in the wall. Dazai rested his spread fingers over the brick, applying pressure until the door clicked. What was before a wall of gray stones swung open to reveal a passage. It led straight to Professor Quirrell's classroom, and was quite possibly the only reason Dazai hadn't completely given up on making it to class every day. How the twins knew about this secret path, among all the other secrets they knew about, was a mystery, but Dazai wasn't complaining. He skipped through the dark tunnel, humming a light tune, as the door slid shut behind him. When both sides of this route were shut, it was blissfully quiet. It wasn't a minute of walking through the empty corridor that Dazai was popping out on the other side. Quirrell's classroom was right across the hall. Dazai took a deep breath and walked right up to it before knocking with the backs of his knuckles. It rapped noisily in the mostly empty hall. There was a shuffling noise from behind the door, and a muted "Coming" that drew an amused smirk onto Dazai's face. He waited with his hands behind his back, swaying on his feet like a little kid might. From the other side of the door, Dazai heard a thud as if something fell over in Quirrell's haste. Dazai took a step away from the door just in time for it to swing open. Professor Quirrell's anxious face blinked down at him. It seemed to take him a moment to realize who exactly had come to visit him. Quirrell's worry melted. "Mr. Dazai, come in." "Gladly," Dazai smiled, pleasantly sliding in past his professor and into the classroom. It was strange seeing the class empty of his peers. He noted with some amusement that a stack of papers and scrolls had fallen to the floor near the man's desk. Dazai walked up to where he usually sat during class before turning around to watch as Quirrell shut the door. "Thank you for having me, sir." The professor offered a shaky smile in return before moving to his desk to collect the fallen pages. Probably student assignments. If the red marks over them were any indication, most of them didn't look to actually be graded yet. Quirrell must have noticed Dazai's wandering gaze, because he made a small sound. "Why, you won't have anything in here, I'm afraid." "Having never done one of my assignments, after all. Writing all that down just seems boring." Quirrell hummed, returning the completed assignments back to what must have been their original position. It was still a mess. The papers were spread haphazardly around the desk in seemingly random fashion. He turned a semi-serious gaze to Dazai. "Right to business, huh? The staff has had many M&M meetings about you. Not doing homework and disregarding directions. Arriving to class late," Professor Quirrell told him, eyes flicking to the wall intermittently. "We discussed our remedial lessons a few times, but in the end, it was only me who thought you might benefit from them." Dazai felt his eyes narrow minutely. "Why's that, sir?" The other professors were right, of course. Training him with magic wouldn't yield any results no matter how much he tried. That sort of thing was just unreachable. Probably what had him on the professor's bad side was that he refused to do his homework. Though it made the fact that Quirrell hadn't also fallen into Dazai's manipulation all the more curious. Maybe I'm just a fool," Quirrell answered, and Dazai forced himself to relax. "But I've always thought every student should get the help they need, if they do need it." "Oh," Dazai blinked. "Just a teacher who wanted all his students to succeed?" Maybe, he thought, setting his bag down on a desk. Still, there was that something about Quirrell that put Dazai on edge. He smiled regardless. "I'm not sure it will do much good. Even like this, I don't think I'll try very hard." "Nonsense." The man somehow looked pleased with himself. "We'll figure out something for you, I'm sure." Every student learns different, but threats of violence were the great equalizer in learning, Dazai knew. He had the scars and the skills to prove it. Maybe. Professor Quirrell nodded, evidently reassured by something in Dazai's expression. "Right then. I think the problem isn't the material itself, is it? Just the spells. So we'll work on that. Let's see your WW wand. Taking his eyes off of Quirrell for a moment, Dazai withdrew his wand case from his bag. It was as clean as ever, probably from disuse more than anything else. It opened with a click. Dazai took out his wand and gave it a lazy wave, then set the case on top of his book bag. Ah, blackthorn? A very nice wood. I hear it's best suited for a warrior. Ollivander must have been mistaken then, Dazai replied listlessly, turning the wand over in his hand. Well, there's more than that, of course. I'm not a wand maker, but I'm sure you might find that sort of thing in the library if you so wanted. May I ask what the core is? Dazai blinked. Blood. He paused, rolling it over in his thoughts for a moment. Was there something else in his wand, too? He hadn't bothered to ask what else would go into the making of his wand after handing over the vial of his blood. Not that it mattered much, in the end. It was never going to work for him anyway. Guess he really bled for nothing back then. Maybe. I forget. Professor Quirrell's eye twitched. It was an odd expression, but it was quickly covered up by that nervous concern once more. Dazai watched the man draw out his own wand. Quirrell's wand was a lot lighter in color than the blackthorn in Dazai's hands. He couldn't identify the wood type, though. Alder wood. The professor said suddenly, catching his gaze. You unicorn hair core, 9 inches long. Not quite so pointy as yours, I'm afraid. Dazai grinned at the wary glance Quirrell shot his way. He laughed hollowly. What spells are we going to be doing today, sir? Quirrell cleared his throat. You recall the Verdimillious charm from class Tifek this week? I'd like to start there, since it's fresh on your mind. The Verdimillious charm was exceptionally simple, Dazai recalled. A simple swish of the wand and saying the spell name allowed the caster to spawn green sparks. Granted, it had a couple of interesting applications. It hurt to touch the sparks, but if left to float around the room, it could illuminate shadows or reveal things hidden by magic. Interesting. Still not worthy of more than 6 pages, Hermione. Nodding, Dazai rolled his wrist experimentally. If his lessons with the Loyalty Club were any indication, Dazai would be standing here for hours, waving his hand around uselessly. After a while, his wrist was going to get sore. When Quirrell gave him a look to continue, Dazai pointed his wand out at the empty room. Verdimillious. Nope. Even now that Dazai had a better idea of what the latent magic around should be doing, there was really nothing to observe. It just continued to buzz around him, undisturbed except to be nullified when it wandered too close. Dazai's stomach roiled with an unexpected wave of nausea, however, and he had to bite down the discomforted expression rising to his face. He shrugged and looked to Professor Quirrell, unsure if he was meant to keep trying. The teacher wore a strange look on his face. Serious, contemplative. Altogether, it wasn't the anxious look Quirrell typically wore. Dazai wondered just what he was seeing with those thinned, assessing eyes. Quirrell blinked when he noticed Dazai watching him for a response, then smiled shakily. Your form is perfect. I'm not really sure what's not working for you. 2. Let me. Quirrell raised his own wand in the arm and gave it a flick. Verdimillious. The instant his professor cast the spell, Dazai could feel the magic react. His wand, pushing the air into shape, his words telling it how to move. There was a quiver in the air. Then the space before them lit up with 100 little green lights. Before the shines could travel too far, Quirrell dismissed them with another wave of his wand. Dazai hummed low in his throat, trying to recall what exactly the man had done. If he closed his eyes, Dazai could almost envision what the magic looked like the second before it had taken shape as Verdimillious. He tried to look nonchalant. Sir? You said the C-core was blood? Quirrell frowned, deliberative. I'm not sure I've ever heard of such a thing before. Blame Ollivander. Dazai shrugged, giving his wand another wave through the air. This time, he focused on the sensation of Quirrell's magic, still a lingering image in his mind, to no luck. With a sigh, he dropped the wand back to his side. A quiver of unrest curled in Dazai's stomach aimlessly. I'm just no good with magic like this. He paused, then added, I'm more interested in other things, I guess. Such as? Magical theory chess, Dazai counted off on his fingers. Pranks. What an interesting R range. Not particularly you, useful in my class." He made a thoughtful noise. "Maybe not. Although perhaps you know a bit about magical creatures from your travels, Professor? I've been wanting to look into that topic ever since Halloween, with the troll and all." Professor Quirrell regarded him for a second. He smiled thinly. Yes, well. We can't just talk all hour. Try once more time for me, please." Dazai blinked, feeling his lips turn up at the corners involuntarily. A non-answer like that. How suspicious. Dazai tried not to feel too amused at the casual dismissal. "You got it, sir. I wouldn't expect much, though. I suspect that you are much better than you think, Mr. Dazai." His fingers twitched over his wand, but Dazai only smiled. Suddenly, the room felt too small. As instructed, he tested the charm once. More to no result. No longer human tickled at the attempt. How curious. Professor Quirrell trailed off. Something about the man's interest made the hair on the back of Dazai's neck stand straight. Another perfect cast. Another perfect failure, Dazai thought, unsurprised. Quirrell seemed to want a reaction, though, so Dazai beamed at him, twirling the wand between his fingers. The mafioso mused. "You can't fix everyone. Perhaps not." "Perhaps not," Dazai echoed lightly. "Shall I try again, sir?" Quirrell smiled pleasantly. "I should think so." Before the night was up, Dazai's headache had returned in full force, and not a single successful cast was there to show for it. But the sharp glint in Quirrell's eyes as he watched his student cast over and over again. Dazai tried not to find the whole ordeal too exciting. Hogwarts was too boring without something to investigate after all. 30 blackthorn berries. Dazai skimmed the book in front of him, staring blankly down at its pages. Why was he looking at this again? Knowing how wands worked wasn't going to help him at all. Dazai couldn't even do magic. He huffed as loud as he could for the library and flipped the page. Stupid Quirrell and his stupid talk of wand making. It was as if he knew that once Dazai was turned onto an idea, he would have to see it through. He stared down blankly at a page titled Blackthorn, Part 4. Dazai was starting to think the author might be a distant relative of Hermione's for how easily they spread a paragraph's worth of information into 4 chapters. "I told you to, he'd be here." Dazai blinked at the interruption, but kept his eyes locked on the book. Obnoxious. People could be so noisy, even in the library. Wasn't there anywhere in this miserable school where Dazai could study in peace? He sunk further into his seat, reading over the line. The average blackthorn flower is 1.5 centimeters in diameter, which is vital to the wand-making process, of course, for a number of critical reasons. Dispassionately, Dazai willed the students to shut up and go away with the stiff hold of his shoulders. At least back home, Dazai had the quiet of his room for studying. Whether it was the library or the bedrooms at Hogwarts, someone was always chattering about. "Hey, Dazai, aren't you listening?" I said. "Good evening." Dazai stop-started. His eyes shot up from the book to see a blonde Slytherin leering down at him. "Draco!" He slid the book across the table. "It was probably better over there, anyway. I don't think I've ever seen you in the library." "I was starting to think you were allergic to studying." The boy bristled, but looked amused behind all the rich kid exterior. "Don't you have that the wrong way around?" Draco's shadows, Crabbe and Goyle, held none of the vague humor of their boss. They were all protective, dim-witted anger hovering over Draco's shoulder. Dazai didn't even spare them a glance. "I don't know, I seem to recall someone failing their last potions assignment. That's not very studious of you, boss." Draco smiled thinly. It wasn't really much of a smile in the end. "Exactly how many potions have you exploded again?" Dazai paused, then shrugged. "Anyway, that's what I thought. Did you need something?" He clapped, voice pitching childishly. "Oh, did you come to wish me luck in my studies? Thanks for cheering me on. But I'm planning to fail, so it won't do either of us much good. I know a pointless endeavor when I see one." Draco barked. He waved off his thugs when they took a menacing step forward. For a moment, Draco let his eyes wander over Dazai's frame, assessing. Dazai wondered just what the other boy was looking for. "You've been at the library a lot lately." He observed idly after a moment. "I like it here. Sometimes it's quiet, and I like it when boss comes to visit me." Draco ground his teeth together and averted his gaze to the side. "You know, if you put half as much effort into your practice as you do into researching. Whatever it is you're always looking into, then you'd be casting whatever spells we throw at you. You mean with the loyalty club? He teased, brows wiggling. It's not a club. For Merlin's sake, Dazai. Really, it was more of a boot camp, but the peeved look on Draco's face was worth the extra hassle. Speaking of clubs, maybe Dazai should invite Professor Quirrell to join. That guy was just as interested in Dazai figuring out magic as the rest of these brats were. Maybe they'd get along, bonding over tormenting him and making his poor wand hand ache. Although Quirrell was probably involved in the whole Halloween fiasco in an unsavory way, so maybe that wasn't a great idea. I've always wanted to be a part of a club, though. There was the click of Draco snapping his tongue on the roof of his mouth, followed by a pretentious scoff. If it were a club, which it isn't, and never will be, you would actually have to show up to be a member. It's been 5 days, aren't you better yet? Dazai's eyes ached in silent answer, still bearing the burn of all the nullifying he'd done yesterday during Quirrell's lessons. Being in Hogwarts all this time had made the constant sting of no longer human a bit slighter, if only because there was so much magic around that Dazai had grown used to the headache. After the troll, and the lessons with Slytherin, and the lesson with Quirrell, now, the effort was starting to stack up again. But that wasn't really what Draco was asking about. Whether he knew it or not, Draco was asking an entirely different question. He beamed. Did you miss having me around? The look Draco gave him was answer enough, so Dazai added, Quirrell is going to keep me busy with lessons for a while. He gestured to the book laid out in front of him. Actually, you two have pretty similar teaching styles. Have you considered a teaching career, boss? Literally, was there any way to teach magic aside from keep casting for hours on end and hope something happened? Because Dazai was starting to doubt there was. Maybe he was just getting unlucky in the mentor department. I'll have you know, my father is a very important public figure. Naturally, I'll be following in his footsteps. Naturally, Dazai said, mentally rolling his eyes. We're kind of the same like that, Dazai wanted to say, but held his tongue. Explaining the mafia to Draco was a bit more than he was willing to put up with. Dazai shrugged, rerouting the conversation. I suppose we can play Wingardium Leviosa out by the Forbidden Forest again, since you're so desperate without me. I don't have another meeting with Professor Quirrell until tomorrow. He tried not to feel too pleased with the affronted look Draco wore. Dazai hid his smirk by turning back to his borrowed textbook. Dazai was only aware that Draco was reading over his shoulder when the other snake read off in a muttering voice. It is only after the harshest of frosts that it can produce truly sweet berries. Malfoy's brows scrunched together and he blinked. What in the hell are you reading? Wouldn't you like to know, Dazai hummed, waving his fingers whimsically before snapping the book shut. A cloud of dust plumed out from the yellowed pages. Just kidding. He shot a blank smile Draco's way when the other boy glowered. I was looking into wand making, but it's all so boring. I don't know why I bothered. Right, Draco huffed. He turned to the two loyal dogs behind him, both of whom jolted to attention eagerly. Crab, Goyle, you can go now. They shared a look that was just as bumbling as anything else they did. Are you sure? Yes, now get out. He practically hissed the words. Neither Crab nor Goyle wasted another second before following his commands, though both shot Dazai a not at all hidden glare. Once they were out of sight, Draco turned back. To Dazai, a grin splitting his face. They're good at following commands, but they won't do us any good to keep around. Blinking, Dazai made a non-committal noise. Wait, he frowned. Keep around. Where are we going? We're going to practice your spells, obviously. Draco nodded, matter of fact. You're feeling better now. I am? Right now? Oh, Draco said suddenly, interrupting his own bombastic tirade to rustle around in his cloak. Blaze wanted me to give you this. Blinking in mystification once again, Dazai took what Draco was holding out. He squinted down at it. You're running errands for Blaze now? It was an apple, shiny and red. Dazai's stomach turned. Only today, since I'm feeling so generous. The blonde gave him a particular look. Besides, he didn't really ask so much as shove it in my hands when I said I was going to fetch you. Blaze can be pretty persuasive when he wants to be. Dazai hummed. He rubbed the apple off on his cloak, shining the side a pearly red. To think that Draco would do that without even one pompous-sounding remark. I'm not sure I buy it, in the end. He clicked his tongue. Still, Draco didn't look especially upset with the remark. There was always something calculating in his gaze just below the surface. Draco would be someone to watch out for, Dazai thought, if the boy ever seriously wanted something. Hurry up and eat your apple already. I went through all the effort to bring it over here for you after all. Can I do that in the library? He asked innocently. The apple was heavy and light in his hands at the same time. Draco only rolled his eyes. Since when have you cared about rules? Just eat it on the way to the training grounds. Training grounds. Don't say that like it's a real thing. Dazai snorted. Retrieving the book from where he'd left it shut on the table, Dazai pushed past Draco to slot it into a random spot on a nearby shelf. He was sure a boring book like that wouldn't go amiss if it was shelved wrong. A glance at Draco didn't suggest otherwise either. Good. Draco nodded. This time he took the lead, guiding an amused Dazai out of the library. Dazai waved amicably at Madame Pince as he trailed after his boss like the obedient dog he was. Madame Pince looked up from her own book and offered him a tight smile. Draco lead with the confidence of someone who would rather die than not be leading. Now start eating. If you pass out today, I'll never speak with you again. What a hefty price, Dazai joked. It kind of was, though. No one in Slytherin except for Draco and company tolerated his presence. Dazai was still a little unclear on just how far that hate went, but he wasn't optimistic. He was pretty sure Crabbe and Goyle would attack him if Draco wasn't around to keep them in line. Regardless, Dazai felt a smile prickling at his lips. I'll be on my best behavior then. Looking pleased with himself, Draco merely smirked. Dazai took up the spot behind Draco rather than beside him, which made it infinitely easier to toss the apple into a nearby potted plant without being noticed. When Malfoy shot him a backwards glance halfway to the training grounds, Dazai smiled serenely. He locked his hands behind his back. It wasn't until they were crossing the grassy field that Draco spoke up again. Speaking of wands, he hummed, have you considered that your wand is broken? Surely wandless accidental magic can't be all that you can do. No. Dazai shivered against a sudden gust of wind and waved to the blurry figure of Blaise and Pansy in the distance. Ollivander made it special for me after all. At that, Draco's brows rose up in something like surprise. Dazai continued, regardless. Boss has been right since the very start. I'm just useless. The only way to escape my worthless existence would be to just die already. Even for a Muggleborn, you are quite inept, Draco conceded. Exactly. So you're in agreement I should die. Could you tell Mori that for me? Because he's always trying to foil my attempts. Blaise cleared his throat. What are we talking about? Nothing, Dazai and Draco said at the same time. They spoke in drastically different tones, but that was neither here nor there. As Dazai began to reach around inside his book bag, Blaise's eyes wandered over his frame. Whatever he saw, the other boy only nodded sedately. Dazai pulled out his wand and gave it a few experimental flicks, then glanced back to Draco. Time for another exciting lesson. Dazai would never say it out loud, at least, not seriously, but he didn't exactly hate these meetings. On occasion, he even found Pansy's grating presence to be enjoyable. More recently, with his new knowledge of magic theory, feeling his fellow Slytherins cast spells had been distantly entertaining. Knowing, feeling, how magic worked, put Dazai in the unique position of being well on his way to understanding just about everything at Hogwarts. And until he knew the true relationship between abilities and magic, Dazai wasn't going to let any magical observations slip him by, even if that meant talking with Pansy and Draco. Blaise was okay, though. Are you just going to stand there all day? Pansy's voice was as horrid as ever. I can't believe you still haven't managed even one spell yet. It's been ages. He's just a slow learner. Draco interrupted, listless. He sat down on the grass and yawned against the chilled wind. Winter would be here soon. Besides, I owe it to him to make him semi-functional. He'll be more useful that way anyway. Yeah, Dazai whined. He cast a half-hearted and entirely unsuccessful Wingardium Leviosa towards Pansy's book bag. Not that I think you'll cast anything successfully, but keep your wand away from my things, will you? Dazai grinned. He raised his wand and pointed it directly at her. Maybe I'll just float you away. She rolled her eyes, clearly expecting him to fail. Pansy wasn't incorrect, of course, but she was annoying. Sure thing, Mr. Remedial Lessons. Boss, Pansy is bullying me. Draco raised a brow. looking between the two of them with a faintly amused smirk painted on his pale face. Can you levitate her? Absolutely not. Well, there you go. Then after a pause, Draco added, Give it a shot. Pansy shrieked in outrage. She drew herself upright, but couldn't seem to decide who to direct her glare at. In the end, it was Dazai who was on the receiving end. Dazai wiggled his wand at her, beaming from ear to ear. Her revulsion at Draco's suggestion, of course, was entirely unwarranted. At the end of the day, this wand was nothing more than a finely crafted stick in Dazai's hands. Don't you dare. But boss asked me to. Laughing, Dazai swished his wand through the air directly at Pansy. Then, with a shit-eating grin, he called, Wingardium Leviosa. Pansy didn't levitate. The magic in the air didn't move. But something did. No one else seemed to notice. He certainly hadn't cast the spell, but it had felt faintly, as if something had happened, like the vague feeling of magic shifting but not. No longer human writhed aimlessly, and Dazai's stomach twisted in protest as a wave of dizziness and nausea rolled through his body. Across the field, Blaze caught his wary gaze with a raised brow and the curious tilt of his head. Dazai let out a breath. While the strange feeling in the air seemed to fade, the tightness in his head and stomach did not. He was just tired. Maybe he should have eaten that apple after all. You're an idiot, Pansy said. Dazai beamed. Well, that was never really under question, was it? Certainly that was what he had felt, right? Thank you, and subscribe for more Bungo Stray Dogs fanfictions. Let me know what was your favorite scene.